50 GMT, sporting with
We're live.
Everyone, my name is Mark Plow. I am chair. Hang on for a moment. There we go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Plow. I am chair of the Select Board. I'd like to call the joint meeting of the Select Board, School Committee, Warrant Committee, and Long-Term Capital Planning Committee to order on Thursday evening, October 20, 2022 at 7 p.m. I'm joined by Chair Adam Dash. Good evening, Adam.
Good evening, Mark.
Member Roy Epstein. Good evening, everybody. Town Administrator Patrice Garvin.
Good evening.
Assistant Town Administrator and Finance Director Jennifer Hewitt.
Good evening.
And other committees. Meg Moriarty, I'll turn to you as Chair of the School Committee.
Thank you, Mark. The school committee does not have a quorum. However, we have Jeff Liberty, Mike Crowley, and myself here tonight.
Okay, that's fine. And to Jeff Lubin, the Chair of the Warrant Committee, I want to call you.
Thank you. Jeff Lubin, Chair of the Warrant Committee. We do have a quorum. Present in person, we Ann Helgen, Bill Anderson, Roy Slapp,
Jack.
Mark Colillo, I'm a member.
Jack Weiss, Mark Colillo, Michael Crowley, myself online. We have Paul Richter. Who else is up there? Sorry, Elizabeth Dion, Bob McLaughlin, and who else? Sorry, Matt Taylor. And am I missing anyone else? That's it for now.
And I don't think that, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think that we have Long-Term Capital Planning Committee representatives here. Do we have the chair? You are? Who's the chair?
Be Chris Doyle.
Is she here tonight? Call the meeting to order. Do we have a quorum, madam?
I don't think we're going to have a quorum.
Okay, so we do have certain members of the Long-Term Capital Planning Committee recently formed and constituted.
Yeah.
Who are they, Adam?
That's a good question. I think Pat is.
Okay, sorry.
And Aaron Ticklingus and Elizabeth Dion, as far as those who are here.
I am.
Okay.
I'll say Chris said we didn't post a meeting
Oh, you did not post a meeting?
No, so
we posted it for you.
unofficially.
We posted by purpose, by our agenda, we posted at the Long-Term Capital Planning Committee.
Maybe.
Not everyone's
I
been
thought
sworn into the committee.
Not everybody was sworn in. Okay, great. We're also joined by the school superintendent as well, John Phelan, and Tony DiColigiero is participating by Zoom, I believe, right, John?
I believe he will be.
Okay, tonight's meeting, this is Budget Summit 2. It's a hybrid meeting. We do have some audience as well. And it's our continued dialogue for our new budget process that we're attempting to implement this year, which is consistent with the College Center recommendations. And tonight's focus will continue to be on the process as well as, I think, further refinement and discussion around revenue. We will have a report out from the school department in terms of enrollment as it relates to revenue. We're not really focused on expenditures tonight, so those of you that want to focus on expenditures, we'll have a future meeting to discuss that matter. But I think, John, your presentation tonight, along with members of the school committee, will be more on enrollment, what it's looking like, different cohorts, and how that has an impact potentially on the 24 revenue projections. Is
Correct.
that correct?
That is correct.
That is correct. Jennifer Hewitt will be presenting this evening, and I think last time the way we handled this is we took questions as we proceeded through. But I think it would be helpful not to be redundant in terms of the questions, in terms of the panelists, and somewhat brief questions that you can pose to Jennifer as we move through this clarity on slides, comments as it relates to slides. I think any discussion outside of the presentation as it relates to specific detailed questions on expenditures probably is not a relevant topic for tonight. We're trying to limit debate. It's important that we continue to sort of collaborate and discuss these issues. So please keep that in mind. I don't know if my colleagues on the board have anything further to add to that.
No, let's get to it.
Okay, great. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Finance Director, Assistant Town Administrator, Jennifer Hewitt, to proceed through. Or should I ask anyone else has any questions in regard to the presentation tonight in terms of process? No? Okay, great. Why don't we begin? As far as anyone participating, I'm sorry, one more point. Anyone participating, we do have a handful of folks outside of the panelists that will be participating. Right now we have about 7 attendees. I will take questions at the end, not during. primarily focused on questions from the panelists as we proceed. So with that, Jennifer, please begin.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Welcome.
It's a pleasure to see everyone. Thank you very much for attending this evening. I apologize. I was not in person my first time. I had a COVID exposure, and I figured it was going to be a lot safer for everyone if I was not in person. So
We thank you for that.
So with that, I'll just jump into Budget Summit 2. Mark just went through the overview, so if we could move through. We went through that part. And then the goals for, just to reiterate the goals of our budget process for FY24. We wanted to reiterate that at least for our current plan for FY 2024, there's no operating override planned. That would take place, if it were to take place, it would be in 2023, and there is no such plan for that. We do have a one-time funding available that we will be discussing further as we go through the evening, but at this point, the FY 2024 budget will be able to be fully funded with available funds.
Yeah, and let me just comment on that. We spoke about this on Tuesday morning during our select board meeting. There has been some chatter in social media. Someone posted it on their website that we had planned a fiscal 24 override for the spring of 23. Unclear to me in terms of where that came from. I don't think we've ever raised it within select board meetings or within any context of the budget summit discussions. I mean, Financial Task Force 2 talked somewhat about the need to continue to consider overrides periodically. There's no time that I can recall at all that we ever say we're going to put an override on the ballot for the spring of 2024. So we are just spelling that rumor again. Thank you, Jennifer.
No, absolutely. So then as we are developing our budgets for FY24, both the municipal and the school departments are developing level service budget projections. We'll be discussing that a little bit further as we get into the presentation tonight. We also, in doing these budget summits, we are doing our best to recognize that we are using some one-time revenues, one-time funds to support the budget. And that means that we're continuing a structural deficit that has been in place for a number of years, and that will continue to be in place until we can until we can restore ongoing funds. And we're wanting to do that in a way that minimizes the impact to everyone in FY25 and 26. We're still working on those plans. We're developing a framework that will help us as we're refining our budgets, refining our projections, and the plan is that we will be reducing our reliance on one-time funds. But unfortunately, that will mean that of one-time funds and eventually an operating override, but the timing on that is unclear. The amounts for that are unclear. And so that's what the purpose of all of our conversations are, both in the meetings tonight and over the course of our budget development for FY24, and then as we're developing FY25 and FY26. So just to touch base on some of our milestones, we'll plan to have this slide at pretty much every summit, just to kind of remind us where we're all going. We are here tonight at Budget Summit 2. We're also looking forward to a town meeting November 29th to December 1st. Our next budget summit will be on December 14th. That will include updated FY24 revenue projections and an initial revenue allocation projection. Then on January 12th, we'll have another summit which will focus on high-level school budget numbers and further refine the FY24 revenue allocation. The preliminary budget that presents the overall budget numbers will be released on February 2nd, and we'll have a budget summit to discuss that budget and present it on February 9th. The governor will have a new governor, and she'll excuse me, they will,
Whomever is elected.
yes, whomever is elected will get 5 extra weeks to present their budget, so that pushes it to March 1st. Then we'll have another summit to review and get further feedback on the summit, on the budget that was presented on February 9th, incorporating any adjustments that may come from the governor's budget. And then our plan is to issue a final budget sometime in April, and so that could be reviewed before it's, and be disseminated to the town meeting members well before they vote on the budget in June. Yes, Lauren?
When I see the high-level school budget numbers discussed in January, will there be a high-level town piece of that as well, or how does that fit into this framework?
That's a good point. I think that would be the general plan for that.
Well, isn't February 2nd our date on the town budget, according to that preliminary town?
When you need to,
Somewhat high.
so you need both at the same time to be able to,
No, I think that's,
allocation?
I think that's our plan, right? And then we'll present a more sort of more refined budget on the 2nd of February.
That's right. And eventually the exact timing of the 3-year projection for the budget will be presented. It will be either at the December or the January summit. And so that will also include the high level, town numbers for sure.
Jennifer, if you don't mind, it might be a similar question, but I also was wondering about the preliminary town budget / budget message release. Could you just explain what you mean by budget message?
That's my message. That's the town administrative budget message that goes along with the budget.
Okay, but that would include as well as also the school.
That would be the intent, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for asking that question. Does that make sense? Then one other thing that I just wanted to add that's not on this slide, but my intent would be, this is the first year that we're doing a revised budget process. It's a learning year. It's a transition year. We're all learning as we go. And the intent would be to have some time to reflect on what we all went through and what worked and what didn't work, frankly, and how we could refine that for FY25 and how the budget, the time frame, it would be helpful to start setting the time frame for the FY25 budget in June, shortly after town meeting. We could reconvene as the group. So I'll put that out there as an idea and see what people think about that. Doesn't have to be tonight, but we can talk about that as we get through further through the process.
Bill.
Jennifer, the governor's budget release, what should we expect from that may affect the budget?
Right. So that's where the state aid for our Chapter 70 numbers. We know what the enrollment numbers, we'll be discussing that tonight, but we are a minimum aid district, so traditionally what that means is that there's a dollar amount per student that gets added to our traditional Chapter 70 allocation, but that's just a projection. The governor's budget is the first step along the way. The House and Senate each will have their own versions, and then there'll be a final number that comes out of the conference committee towards the end of June, but usually the governor's budget is the minimum that we'd be able to expect. And
We also have unrestricted general municipal aid as well, Bill, and do we get up at 90 at that point as well?
No, that's a separate process.
Later on. So typically the governor's budget historically is floor. The governor's budget the last few years has been somewhat the floor on state aid, and legislature has, I think it's been consistently a little bit higher from the governor's budget. We'll see what the new governor's proposal will be.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
So we wanted to throw a very preliminary slide in here about the potential use of free cash for FY 2024. Last summit, we talked about the availability of free cash and where the sources were coming from. Now we have our $15.5 million that's available to us for FY24. At this point, we have a very round number of $6 million projected to support the operating budget. I'm also carrying forward the FY23 OPEB funding. I need to validate the calculation of that funding level with the treasurer about the policy with that. So that number may move, but that's a pretty strong starting point.
Jennifer, can I ask you a question on the 6? Is that all from free cash, or does that 2 million include from does that also include 2 million from ARPA?
And it is all from free cash.
So it doesn't include the 2 million that's shown in the ARPA fund? I guess that's for 2024, yeah, that's shown for the ARPA funds going to the operating budget?
Can we hold that question?
Sure, okay, no problem. I'm one page ahead.
It's not, but you'll be able to see
Is just
it.
from the 15.5 that's been certified.
Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yep,
That's
absolutely.
great. Yes, Jack. Sorry, John.
We have a target of 3 to 5% of our annual budget in reserves. The 1.7 is clearly below that, but are you including the capital stabilization and the general stabilization in that number so that we know that we are comfortably hitting that target?
Yeah, I know which policy you're speaking of. Right now, I think it specifically says that we're supposed to have a certain percentage of free cash that is.
That are free cash guidelines?
Yes.
Is that what you're referring to, the 3 to 5%?
That's right. That's right. So it would be a little under that guideline, but we feel that by putting it in the reserve, we're meeting the reserve policy that the board and the finance committee. I apologize, I'm straining here.
Hard time here.
That the board and the finance committee did in terms of the financial policies, which we have, I believe, 50% of the operating budget is in reserves.
To me, we want to be within the guidelines, Jack. I mean, it's just we have it as a policy, the rating agencies look at it. It's not a policy, it's guidelines.
It's guidelines, but I thought there was a discussion a year or two ago about adjusting the base to which the 3 to 5% is applied, because I think as the policy is written, it includes revenues raised from debt exclusions, which doesn't seem really appropriate because the money debt exclusions are all spoken.
You mean on the expenditure, so the budget is, right, on the expenditure side, you mean?
Yeah, because I thought we talked about revising the guideline to be 3 to 5%.
Okay, we can consider that.
Yeah, and we talked about explicitly stating if it's in a stabilization fund accounts, rather than just being.
I think that's a great point.
But it should be exclusive of monies raised from debt exclusions.
You want to read?
Just to be clear, though,
Yeah, Ian, go ahead. Yeah, Aaron has his hand up as well. Go ahead. Yeah. No, go ahead, Ian.
the 5.2 and the 2 million would then go to our reserves, right? So that would be added to the 1.7.
Yeah, you're going to 7.2 plus another $1.7 million.
Anything else, any other increases in the other endowment funds or anything like interest, whatever?
On the slide here, not the ones we got in the email, but there's 2 million balance as well. See that, 2 million?
Could I,
Go ahead.
would you mind if I just, rather than having the questions kind of starting all at once, could I get through the whole slide before we start asking
Yeah, please,
questions? Would
please
that
go
be
ahead.
okay?
Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. So then the goal, honestly, the capital stabilization, the general stabilization, these are just placeholder dollar amounts. We wanted to put something down here so that we had something just to see what it looked like, okay? That was really what the goal was. We put that as the description to say TBD, it's an initial deposit. Capital stabilization, now we have the Comprehensive Capital Budget Committee, and we really want to be focusing more on the capital needs of the community, not just for larger capital, debt exclusion projects, but like real maintenance costs that will help prevent additional capital needs down the line. So this was just more to start socializing the idea. And then obviously the capital committee is going to have some further input, and the warrant committee is going to have some further input. Also the general stabilization fund, that's again just a placeholder. I mean, that you see is kind of the slush fund at this point, because what we were trying to do is get back to just a traditional carry forward of 2 million. What we're concerned about is that the 15 million of free cash just seems like a lot, like a big number. And, that's what a lot of people focus on, but A good chunk of that, 7.8 million, was carried forward from the prior fiscal year. So it's not new money that the town is all of a sudden getting, and it's sending a mixed message. So this is one approach. There's plenty of others. And so that was really what, I mean, it's good to have the conversation. So thank you for that. And I also just wanted to highlight that if you go back to our free cash slide from the first summit, that carry forward number in FY21 and 22, they're just very slightly off. And we're looking at these numbers in different ways. I'm still developing my underlying structures. So we didn't have time to really track that down. So I just wanted to that eventually.
So thank you, Jennifer. I think it makes sense to adopt the approach to see whether there's any questions that work.
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you. Yes.
I think Jack has.
In your mouth, but as you characterized it, it strikes me that is money set aside with the intent to spend. The general stabilization and the remaining balance of free cash are truly emergency rainy day funds for, or could be used for next year's operating budget, but they're
I say yes and no, Jack. I mean, so for example, recently we had to replace the salt shed rather quickly, and we used ARPA money to do that. If we didn't have the ARPA money, that would have been something that I would have proposed that we potentially used for the general stabilization fund or at a later town meeting.
okay.
My question was, of the 15 million in free cash, is that inclusive of the remaining opera money that's around 3.7? So there's opera money on top of that?
That'll be the next slide.
The next slide, John.
Yeah, this is all free cash. So this is all.
Chris Doyle has her hand up. Chris, on Zoom. Chris, we can't hear you, Chris. You need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I think Aaron has had his hand up longer than me, but I just wanted to make sure the 2 million in the capital stabilization, that is, I'm assuming, not in lieu of whatever we would fund in the operating budget for capital.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions in this slide, team?
I think Aaron online.
I don't see his hand up.
My question was really my question was really about the capital stabilization fund. That's contingent on town meeting approving that fund and funding it, right?
That is correct. Yes.
So if we don't, that'll just slide somewhere else. I think we probably will, but we don't know. Okay.
Well, it would, if we don't do anything with free cash, it would carry forward into the free cash for next year.
Okay.
Thank you, Aaron.
Jennifer, just, this is kind of mechanical, but in terms of reading the schedule, is the first line is what's available at the beginning of the year, and then the bottom is what's available at the end of the year?
Well, what happens is this, it's just simple math where we're just, the operating budget is the support, the ongoing structural deficit. Then the OPEB is the support that is being put into the OPEB stabilization fund from free cash.
I understand
that. And then the fuel, like we ended up funding a little bit from fuel tanks in FY23. So the total authorizations there, town meeting votes to authorize the use of free cash. And then you're subtracting the free cash available, you're subtracting the total uses from that to get to the remaining balance. And that then seeds the free cash for the following fiscal year.
But if this number, the 15.53 is as of July or June 30th or July 1st.
Certified.
2020. So just so people understand that.
Well, my question.
Certified free cash as of July, but it's not
time, folks.
until fiscal year 20.
Right, 15 million was certified free cash that we are now in a position to appropriate. Okay?
I understand.
Understand that part of the, what this is saying, potential, is that at some point, select board is likely going to recommend some type of seeding of a cap stab fund and a general stab fund. These are just placeholders.
No,
and then if these amounts are appropriated by, these amounts would have to be appropriated by town meeting in order to get to that balance at the end of the year, but we haven't appropriated them yet.
So Jennifer, what happened between the 7.8 and 15.5? How do we go,
Right, so that's what we discussed last summit. There was a slide that talked about, there was about 1.5 million in extra revenue that came in during the fiscal year, and then there were some turnbacks that came from both town and school sources and some other sources as well. So it's
Jennifer, sorry, could I maybe restate the question and the answer? As I understand it, the top line here, like the 15026, that's the certified free cash at the beginning of the fiscal year. So the 15026 would be free cash as of July 1, 2022, because the fiscal year starts in July. What follows in the FY23 column are expenditures that we expect to make out of free cash as of today. And if nothing else changed, that would leave 7.837 at the end of the year.
So what's not here is all the other ins and outs that happen as a
well, right, as we don't know what they are now, so 7.837 is ignoring all of that. And then when you go to the next year, the 15.553, that reflects an expectation of these various other funds that'll
flow into free cash and get certified to get us to
15.553 expected as of July 1, 2020.
And those are all results. Those are all factuals versus budget during the year.
Yeah. If that's not correct, then please.
That's not correct. Okay, 15.5 is free cash as of July 1st, 23. That's been certified for appropriation. So that balance we have today.
That's of July.
This is a fixed number.
22, excuse me, 22 for the 24 budget.
Right.
The overages on revenue and the givebacks on expense will be, that's an experience in 23 that will then roll into, at the end of the 23 fiscal year, into free cash that will then need to be certified by the Division of Department of Revenue as of July 1st, 23, to be appropriated for the 25 budget. That's how it works.
But Mark, if you had zero turnbacks and zero excess revenue,
15.5, that's it.
The remaining balance of 7.8 would flow to the top of the fiscal year 24. What's not in there is a projection of 6.7 or whatever the number is of turnbacks and excess revenues that will leave us with 15.5, not 7.8 at the start of fiscal year 24.
That's correct.
Well, except the 15.5, just to be clear, well, it will not, it's certified. So the turnbacks from fiscal year 23 will create the 23, end of 23 free cash
certification
will be certified for the following two budget cycles. So this budget cycle, that's what I was saying, the July 1st, 2022 is what's used in the 24 budget. Once we have the 23, it will be used in the 25 budget. It's more than a year's.
Check your phone. The 15.553.790.
I think we're all saying the same thing. Essentially,
Well, I don't think so. I'm certain the 7.8 is in the 15.5.
That's right.
The 7.837732 was not appropriated for the 23 budget. That amount of money is in the 15.553.790. That's just been certified to be appropriated for the 24 budget.
And the ins and outs in 22, which were here, were added to that, which were 7 point something, were added to the 7.8 to get to that 50. But we've already experienced them, the fiscal year 22 revenue and expenditure differences.
They're just not displayed.
15.5 is cash in hand for us to allocate for the upcoming fiscal 20.
That's correct.
Yep.
We will then get a certified free cash next July.
That's correct.
Based on the turnbacks to FY23
You cannot appropriate free cash until it's been certified.
It's always 1 year in the rears.
Okay, sorry, then I was confused by the headings at the top.
Yeah. 15.5 is money that we have in the bank that has been certified by the Department of Revenue that we can now appropriate for the 24 budget.
So if you follow this process, at the end, the 2 million would be what would be rolled over, and anything that comes back to us during this fiscal year.
That's correct.
That to be the new
That's correct.
Certified free cash for fiscal 25.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yes, yes, Jeff.
My question is not about anything we previously discussed. You may be happy to know.
We can go through it 5 more times if you like.
Oh, it's fine. I think we have it.
It's not confusing. It is. It is confusing.
It's a year off, so it's good.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I'm wondering, just at the level of the paradigm of the budget that we're trying to enact here, about how we should begin to think about any amount of money that ends up in the remaining balance of free cash. And Jeff, you make me think that the assumption is we're just going to roll it over, right? And I guess I want to ask that question because otherwise we would have had to have burned the capital stabilization and the general stabilization for unforeseen emergencies, right, in order to touch whatever that number is. That's right. The given fiscal year. Is that fair to say? At the level of like the model. Depends how you decide to do it. I mean, capital free cash is a half, 50 plus 1% of town meeting votes. Stabilization fund expenditures 2/3. So you could decide to take it out of free cash and not take it out of the stabilization.
I see. An analogy that we've used in the past is that free cash is your bank account and a stabilization fund is your savings account. It makes you think a little bit more about pulling out.
Oh, there's cookies in the jar and one's in a higher shape.
Yeah.
You know, they're just harder to get.
Jeff, whatever the decision is on seeding those accounts, that's an appropriation. So town meeting, which is the appropriating body, legislative branch, if the board puts forth and we collaborate and say we want to seed a cap staff fund of $2 million and a general staff fund of $4 million, just using these numbers today, that is an appropriation into those funds. And that will be the budget for 24, and you can't use those funds in 24 unless you reconvene town meeting, which is a legislative body, to then appropriate out of those funds. Do you follow my point?
Absolutely.
That's an appropriation to a reserve fund that can't be touched. We can't touch it unless it's appropriated, funds are appropriated out of those capital stabilization or general stabilization fund. If there's a need during the 24 fiscal year to do that, we would have to convene town meeting, which is the only appropriating body that we can convene. The only other reserve balance that can be determined to be used, there's two, is the reserve fund that the warrant committee will have appropriated of $400,000, and there may be some amount in that special education fund in which the select board and school committee appropriate from. So does that make sense?
Leftover ARPA.
Or leftover ARPA. ARPA does not need appropriation. It's simply a decision
Appropriated by the select.
By the select board.
So we are anticipating specific needs in specific budget categories that we don't want to spend, per se.
That's right. I mean, look, we're trying to build up reserves. I don't know whether these are the numbers. It's unclear. These are just placeholders right now.
Right. I'm asking about the categories, and your answer was very helpful. So thank you.
But once you appropriate into them, you can't, if town meeting votes to appropriate into them, you cannot take money out of them until town meeting appropriates monies from them.
That's right.
Hence the fuel tank discussion.
Right. Okay, well, sorry. Any other questions on this slide? It's confusing concept, but Jennifer.
And so if I could also, as we're talking, I think it's important to clarify that realistically, the decision around how to fund this and the level of funding, we're going to need to have a much larger conversation around what are the goals, what are our fiscal goals, and how are we going to meet them? What are the vehicles that we're going to use to meet those goals? How are we planning? What are we planning on funding? When are we planning to tap into it? How is that going to affect the overall budgets of both the municipal and the school budgets, as well as the Belmont taxpayer? So all of that needs to get factored in. This is just simply a placeholder that we would like to be, rather than having it continue to just simply carry forward in free cash, we would very much like to set it aside somewhere. That's to be determined. So if I could, that will just wrap that up.
Okay, we can move on to the next slide, I believe.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. One more quick question on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
We could end up, part of it might be to preserve some for use in a future budget cycle if we did not
That would
Not
be part
able
of
to.
the conversation.
Not able to, okay.
Well,
So
that's
so
part of the
right.
discussion around the general stabilization fund.
Right.
Is to
not the capital, but the general stabilization, okay.
general staff fund, which we've done in the past,
Okay.
as you know,
That's enough.
money aside in a reserve fund for future operating budgets.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ann.
Okay. So this is just a simple report out on where we stand with our ARPA funding. We have 7.8 million and a small amount of change in our ARPA grant. And we had appropriated 844,000 in FY22. There was considerably more activity in FY23. Primarily, we had added the $1 million for the solar panels. There was a small portion funded in the municipal budget, and then the school has $1 million that they're funding their positions there. There was a small an appropriation for the fuel tanks. Some of our union contracts had COVID stipends. We have some other potential stipends pending. The rink has received $350,000 in design funds, and the DPW salt shed was recently approved for $500,000 for a total of $3.5 million in FY23, and we have $2 million set aside in FY24. That is a total of $6.3 million that we have designated for use. And of our $7.8 million, that leaves us a balance of just more than $1.4 million. That money does need to be committed by December of 2024.
Yep.
And it needs to be spent by December of 2026. So there is a time limit on that. And that's just good for us to keep in mind.
I know we're not talking about expenditures tonight, but I just want to be clear and make sure I understand. That $2 million is a total swag as to how the budget process will end up. The $2 million of fiscal year 2024. How and what that number is all part of the budget process. That is not committed, decided, anything at this point in time. It's just a placeholder number. It could be $500. It could be whatever. Okay.
So for example, Jack, when we were doing the FY23 budget, I think we had a similar number set aside. And as you can see, we only used 1.3 million and 1.1 million for the schools, and then 163 on the town side.
Good question, Jack. Others on this slide. Okay. Thank you, Jennifer.
So this was a slide that we had considerable conversation about this at Summit 1. The main thing for bringing it back is just to really kind of continue to emphasize the fact that we do have a structural deficit and how it has grown over the years. I have added in the FY24 budget with the placeholders here for the $6 million of free cash and the $2 million of ARPA funds down at the bottom. So again, how that all rolls through the budget is continuing to be determined, but just the nomenclature and getting everyone familiar and comfortable with what is a structural deficit and why it's a problem is kind of important, because right now the free cash number has been healthy in the past, but one of the main drivers for that is that we had less spending during COVID, and we were able to divert a lot of our spending onto COVID grant funding sources. And so then that allowed us to turn back more in our budgeted funds and helped drive up the balance in the free cash number. I know that I think the schools have been better able to fill some of their vacancies than the town has. We currently have a large number of vacancies, and that's going to end up driving some higher free cash numbers in FY24, in FY23, excuse me, by the June 30th of 2023. So we need those positions. We can't not have them, but we're not spending the funding on those salaries and on those benefits at the moment. So that people should not be surprised about that, but that's not going to be a sustainable model going forward. Our staff are burning out, to say the least. So.
One thing, as I thought about this more in light of the Collins report, Belmont is still going to have this sustainability problem just because we're going to rely on overrides periodically, right? I mean, there's always going to be some uncertainty because the ongoing revenues, subtracting that override, which can only last for 3 to 4 years, presumably, you're still in this cycle. So we're not one of those towns or cities that has a recurring revenue minus overrides to carry us through in the.
We don't have a large commercial base. We have 4%.
Exactly. So
Cambridge has $150 million in free cash. They're on $150 million under the levy. They don't need to go for overrides.
No, I understand that. So I'm saying that every 3 or 5 years, there's going to be some uncertainty as to whether an override will pass. Like, we're never going to get to that perfect situation. Is that fair or not?
Well, Lori, I think I'm 5 months in, so it's a little soon for me to be able to say that definitively. What I would like to get to is at least to then have the conversation, so that if by setting the revenues to begin with, then if we're trying to meet have our expenses meet the available revenues, and then we want to spend above that, we're making the conscious decision as policymakers that it's worth tapping into that and adding to the structural deficit for those services that are needed. And that's a conversation to be had every year. So we can. And that's just, ongoing policy conversations. Again, if there's opportunities to identify other sources of revenue that might help to offset that could be, if there are other ways to streamline town or school services, we could pursue those opportunities. And it's going to be important that we not simply allow those savings to just simply get absorbed into greater budget increases, but be part of the overall conversation. So there's a mix of levers, and it's definitely something to continue to have to continue to discuss in the groups like this.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you.
Is the $1 million that is reflected as school funding for fiscal 23 on the prior page included in the 1.205 on the bottom of this chart? In other words, is it grant? And then the 2 million would be, so really our one-time funds would be 8 million if you use the 6 and the 2 for fiscal 24, and they're 7.1 or 7.2 million for fiscal year 23 if you include the outside funds.
That's what we discussed last.
Okay.
Yes.
John.
I only wanted.
That is included in the budget. It's not a separate fund that was included in the school budget.
It was not.
So the million's not included in the school.
I just wanted to touch on Laurie's point. I think the entire room is too young to remember that Proposition 2.5 was not meant to be a perfect scenario. It was meant to make sure that the voters were asked if a town or municipality needed to spend more than 2.5%. I don't believe it was the intent that 2.5% increases on an ongoing basis would be enough revenue to support budgets that are growing at normally 4 or so % a year. In I think a lot of districts or a lot of towns have overrides every 3 to 4 years, Laurie, to your point, as part of their financial planning process over the long run. So I don't want to leave folks with the impression that we have to get to that mark because that's how everybody else lives. I don't think there's a lot of folks who live in that 4 or 5 year range of needing to do something different to infuse revenue in order to support expenses that go up by a little more than 2.5% every year.
The intent was an override was not a negative thing. It was just a decision-making policy.
No, that's correct. And it allowed the residents and the taxpayers in each community to decide whether whomever the governing body was, be it members of select boards or city councils, or mayors, to decide whether they want to ask the taxpayers of the community for additional receipts. Notice that the mayor Newton is putting forward a $15 million override in the upcoming year. And the way I've always looked at it, just to simplify it, there's only two levers to pull. That is the revenue lever or the expense lever. And on the expense side, what we as, that participate in town government is we are, as policymakers, as Jennifer indicated, attempting to deliver services that our residents are asking for us to deliver. It's not like we are deciding. This is what we get back in terms of the type of services we deliver, which is challenging to balance what those are. We can prioritize and eliminate some, and which ones would we eliminate to reduce structural deficit? Or we can look for ways to do services differently. I've been saying this for 20 years. Structural Change Impact Group came up with a number of ideas in terms of doing that. That's a challenge, but there is some approaches we can take incrementally to reduce the expense around a delivery of a service. So that's something we're certainly looking at. There's additional ways to look at revenue pilot payments over capped from a commercial perspective, and that's challenging as well. So every year it's been a real difficult thing to try to balance those two matters. So there's only two levers to pull, top line or bottom line, or expenditures. So that's a balance we're attempting to achieve every year, and that creates the challenges and contentiousness in the community and so on and so forth. Jennifer, any other questions on this slide?
Aaron has his hand up.
Oh, sorry, Aaron.
I was just going to make a comment that I think that there's like a education needed in the town broadly about what a structural deficit is versus a deficit. I think it might have been Lori a few years ago in the Warrant Committee did a presentation about where she showed the two non-parallel lines, and that you can move one of the lines, but since they're non-parallel, they're eventually going to cross, right? I thought that was a really great illustration to say that this isn't just like a one-time thing or that we're spending too much or don't have enough. There's a pattern imposed by Proposition 2.5, right? It's not just that we have more, we spend more than we made. It's that like over time, no matter what we do, we can cut our services, but eventually the cost of the services we provide will exceed our revenue because the rate of the cost increases faster than the rate of the revenue increase, right? So, but I feel like that's going over a lot of people's heads. They just think we're running a deficit. And I think we need to make sure that we need to do something broadly if we can, whatever our policy is, to make that clear to people. Because I think that the policy will be based on that fact, right? Not just don't have enough money one time. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you, Aaron. And the dollars, the structural deficit dollars are on this slide. You can see, right? So if you think about what a definition of structural deficit is, you take your total one-time funds for 23 of 5.9 plus the 1.2 of COVID funding. That's the quantified aspect of structural deficit. We need to use one-time funds to balance our budget. That's the point that the Collins Center and Steve Cirillo was making to us, is that we continue to rely on one-time funds to balance our budget because we are a structural deficit. And we need to work harder at looking at how we generate revenues, looking at our expenditure lines to try to reduce the amount in reliance on one-time funds. We're committed to that. But I think Lori Slapp's point is that there will always be a structural deficit unless you can find additional receipts. And we can't expect, nor should we expect, the state to bail us out in terms of state aid. Thank you.
Okay. So this again is a very similar, pretty much the same slide that we had up last time. It's just again giving our preliminary revenue forecast. There's been a slight update to the available funds where I had updated the free cash available to reflect the to reflect the use of free cash for OPEB. So that is reflected in there. The difference between the FY23 available funds and the FY24 available funds is primarily from the use of that $1 million for the sale of town-owned property and the $545,000 that was used for capital projects from prior authorized balances. So that's the prime difference between those two numbers. And I just wanted to also highlight that this, again, it is preliminary. We're still tracking this down, and my goal would be to have a much more solid number for you all come December, so that I definitely have my work cut out for me, Matt and I. And the enterprise receipts are also going to be further refined in there. We're taking a very fine pencil to review what the correct level of funding is for our water and sewer indirect contributions. And we're also looking to spend some more time looking at the rates for the water and sewer, and maybe hiring a consultant to help us, review those. That more will be coming, but that's the sewer fund in particular. It didn't end up in a deficit, but the level is not sufficient to continue to support the contributions, especially to capital that it had done in the past, and to capital, but also to the indirect contribution. So that more to come on that.
I was not at the first session, so I apologize if you covered this before. Can you help me understand what the available funds line means and what revenue offsets means? I look at available funds and I think subtotal, and that's not what that is. And I'm trying to sit here, think about what a revenue offset is that's not an expense. So
I appreciate that, Jack. Thank you very much. I think it's important that we all have that. And the other piece that I'm also working on, and I just wasn't able to finish it for tonight, but I have a very detailed revenue report that I'll be able to distribute before the December meeting, that will be able to detail to your heart and Helgen level of detail.
there goes the printing expense for this year's budget.
But that will help to further answer those questions. But relating to that, from my perspective, an available fund is just simply funds that are in another source right now that will be transferred in to help fund the budget. So that's the parking fund, the capital endowment fund, the capital projects on prior balances, free cash to support the operating budget, free cash to support the OPEB contribution, any potential, other capital projects funded from free cash, the perpetual care fund, the sale of town-owned property, the overlay surplus, and then there was a small amount that we funded in the ARPA dollars in FY23. And then, the use of the general stabilization fund as well.
So it's a discretionary allocation of those other reserves or other.
Exactly. So it's just, that's the place where it kind of comes into the bottom line of the budget, to the revenue line of the budget. But then to speak to your second question, which was the offsets, this is where the cherry sheet assessments are plugged in, because what really happens, I think in the past, those have been viewed as a spending item, but realistically, we don't have any control over that. The state giveth and the state taketh away, and so in this case, they set our cherry sheet, and at the same time, there's this other page that says, okay, these are the assessments that we're going to deduct from your cherry sheet, and you're not going to get it in the end. So that's, you're not going to receive those funds in the end. So that's where those are primarily coming from. And then that also relates to, that's where the overlay is put in. So we've been funding the overlay at $840,000 in recent years where the assessors pay for the abatements from that.
Say that again?
Overlay. That's where if someone files for an abatement.
Oh, I see. Yeah, okay.
We have a fund that's called the overlay.
Gotcha.
And that overlay is funded traditionally at $840,000.
Abatements, basically.
Exactly, yes.
That's right, Bill.
Jennifer, would it be fair to look at the offsets as simply a net of state aid and net the two out and not have to think about it?
Somewhat. I think it's net of state aid, but the overlay is an important aspect of that.
You could break that out and leave that, right? Everything else with net. I'm just thinking from a confusion standpoint.
Right. I think, though, that what happens is that the way that the state reports it is the state wants us to, to see this big number. And then if we don't,
There are seat reductions, whatever.
Also want to track the trends on both, on broken out.
We can break out the overlay sort of as a separate sort of board.
We really don't have any control over either line, right?
Do you have control over the overlay?
We do have control.
800,000, but that's within the, what you said, it's within the offsets line, right?
That's right. Right.
Questions on this slide, Meg?
I don't have a question, actually. I just wanted to, maybe it's a bit of an opinion on a clarification in a little bit aligned with the Prop 2.5, like whether it has a negative connotation or what it was really meant to be. And when we're talking about not using one-time funds, and that's not what we're supposed to be doing with our budget, I think that is a little different from the ARPA funds, which are also, we're talking about those as one-time funds, right? And those are meant to be spent for needs that we have due to COVID. And I think we really need to, when we have that conversation, like, I don't think those should be things that we're thinking about hanging on to, waiting to see what happens. Like, we have real needs now where those do need to be used. And so I guess I see those ARPA one-time funds a little bit differently than I see the other way that we're talking about.
We have to spend them anyway, I think. So we've gotten 7.8, and I think from our point of view, there's no reason to hang on to them. We're going to spend them for the needs related to the impact of COVID, absolutely.
Right, but I see that as like a positive way of using
It's a positive way. Yes, that's correct.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's more around the free cash each year. Jeff?
I would just add to that, as long as they were one-time expenses, if you add them to reoccurring expenses, that money will run out, and then you're going to have to figure out how to fund those.
Without question.
Positions. Yeah, positions.
That's correct.
Other questions? Anyone online? Good slide, thank you.
I can't resist
go ahead.
responding to what you just said. So I think what's hard about it, I know we'll get to expenditures, is let's say we're talking about mental health, right? And you want to make a one-time investment in a mental health professional to address the current perceived need within the budget of a mental health emergency, which I think we can all agree is actually happening. It's hard to say that one should not spend money on a position when the need is there. The same way, like, we pay for a roofer when a roof fails, right? It's a specific moment in time. The difference between a roof and a mental health emergency is that the roof gets fixed if your roofer is any good, whereas mental health is a little trickier in that regard. So it's not exactly, I'm debating what you're saying. It's just, I want to more complicated.
I agree. It's just that if we want that mental health professional the following year and that money has been used, we just have to figure out how to fund it through a different source.
Absolutely.
But yes, if there's a one-time position, then sure. And that's what we've done in the last 2 years with the ARPA.
100%.
Significant chunk of the ARPA.
100%. And with academic remediation as well. It's all sort of of a piece.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Josh. Good slide, Jennifer. Thank you. I think with that, from this questions. You have a question?
You're not taking public questions until the end, right? Or if
no, we're not taking public questions to the end. So whoever may have raised their hand, I will absolutely leave your hand up. We'll recognize you. But with that, I'm going to turn this over to our school superintendent, John Trailing, to go through and give us an enrollment.
Sure. Thank you very much, Mark. And Jennifer asked me to present the enrollment tonight through the lens of how enrollment would affect revenue, because our enrollment and all enrollment in public schools impacts Chapter 70 in everyone's budget. So the next slide shows the enrollment through a longer view from 2018 to 2022. For folks who were here prior to COVID, you remember that our enrollment was going up by over 100 students a year for a long period of years, at least 2012 through 2019, with a good increase each year. COVID obviously put a stop to that growth and actually came in with a decrease, which you can see right there. On the following slide, after the budget's been rectified and our enrollment now tends to look different, the 3-year view of that shows an aggregate reduction from October 1st, 2020 to October 1st, 2022 at 54 students. It continually sees an increase at the high school level of 55 students over that 3-year period. It sees a decrease at the middle school in grades 5 through 8 of 43, a continuation of a decrease at our elementary level of 66 students. So the lenses that we want to look at.
Did you have a question on the prior slide?
No, this one, I didn't.
Let John finish.
Continue, I didn't.
Sure, yeah, I'll hold it this way. The data that we want to give you tonight is through 4 lenses. One is the aggregate enrollment, and then after this slide, we will talk about the mandated service subgroup enrollments that are also important to keep an eye on in terms of school districts.
I noticed that K4 was the only one that showed 22 was below the level of 21, and I just wanted to know of the detail. Is that like kindergarten? Do you have the K4 where the breakout lies? Or
I have the detail right in front of me. Right now, our lowest cohort, which is the accumulation of the entire grade, is kindergarten at 279 students, which has produced some favorable class sizes. Last year, during budget season, we thought about reducing one kindergarten teacher for the year that we're in. We decided to not do that, related to the fact that our students coming into kindergarten last year really presented some challenges, knowing that they did not have a normal preschool experience, and their kindergarten experience is that much more difficult. So we decided to keep the class size lower on purpose. But that will definitely be something that will be evaluated during this budget process going towards FY24.
I can ask a question about that, the K through 4. Is that just no new kids coming into the district at the kindergarten level? I mean, it's 240 down since 2018, so pretty significant reduction. Is that parents are, during the COVID years moving to private schools? Is that part of sort of what occurred there to some extent? Or
I don't know the unpacking of each of the numbers. Yeah. And, we did utilize a service to project our enrollment prior to COVID. We may re-engage them again so we can kind of get an assessment of
families are still moving
post-COVID means. Right. We do know, though, from history that our kindergarten numbers have always started at a number that has then grown over time as the cohort has worked its way through 1, 2, 3, first, second, third, and fourth grade. So kindergarten is lower than normal. Kindergarten is free. Kindergarten is something that we would like every single family to take advantage of. But we do see cohorts get bigger as they go through the system.
Okay. Thank you, John. Ian?
I sort of recall recently seeing birth rate numbers being lower too. So starting in 2017 or so. So that would affect the sort of in Belmont.
Turnover in houses in Belmont is less than.
Yeah, I would have thought so too.
During COVID years, even though housing prices have gone up dramatically, maybe not as many young families are moving to town.
Yeah.
There's got to be some explanation as to why kindergarten is down.
To your point, now that it's free, there should be more people in kindergarten.
Correct. Right.
Unless if they can't afford to live here, then
that
not going to have kids coming in.
Yep.
Having kids, right?
That could be part of it. Housing prices have gone up dramatically in Belmont. Absolutely. Jack.
John, before we go on to the cohorts, thinking about Chapter 70 money, which I think is the enrollment, I have a fuzzy recollection that through COVID, the state kind of did a make whole or a keep well, so that if your Chapter 70 funds were below what your per students were going to be, they would not cut your Chapter 78. 2 questions. Is that still in place, and we expect that to be in place? And is there, do we know how many students we have to grow or expand enrollment before we ever start to receive Chapter 70 money based on the per head count?
Sure. So yes, Belmont is held harmless, so our Chapter 70 will never go down, but it will only start to increase for every student after we reach, I believe, the threshold of where we were in October of 2019. So that number that is actually on the previous chart, it would have to break the threshold of the 4633, I believe, to be able to.
Roughly 300 students.
Correct.
We don't have any Chapter 70 impact until enrollment grows by more than 300 students.
Correct. And we also have been available for the $30 a head or $60 a head from the state that was given out last year. And that's essentially the $186,000 that we got late in June, the Chapter 70 ad. So that does not preclude us from not receiving those types of funds as it relates to our head count.
Thank you.
John?
Great. So then we look at historically our mandated service subgroups. And what we're seeing here on this slide is from 2018 to 2000. We saw a 5-year increase of 65 students. The percentage underneath each of those numbers represents that our EL students represent on October 1st of 2022, 10% of our population. That's not a 10% increase from the year prior. That just means it's now that population of students represents 10% of our overall population. That increase over a 3-year period, which is more significant for us from where we are and where we're going, is 92 students over a 3-year period. So that begins to tell us that our students who are coming to Belmont who need the service have come in at the later parts of the last year and a half, 2 years. And that was very evident in this school year that we started, where we saw a large increase from June of 2022 to September of 2022. On the following, I'm sorry.
And I feel, I might have said it before this group, but I think people don't understand what English language learner means. And you have educated me that it means not somebody whose family speaks a different language or grew up speaking a different language. It's somebody who cannot do grade level work in English. Correct?
Correct. So the interesting part of that conversation, Jack, is that you get assessed if your family speaks another language or another language is spoken in your home. So the district is obligated to test every student whose guardian checks that box on the application. And you'd be surprised that of the almost 300 kindergarten students we had this year that enrolled, 60% of the students tested because they have some sort of a second language spoken in their home they're speaking. So you can see that just by that data point, we're looking at a larger pool of folks, but it is actually a multi-phased assessment of students looking to achieve the goal of doing grade level work in the language of English versus just having some English that they could use, which is a very different standard to meet.
I mean, to me, that helps people understand the real need for the service.
Correct. Correct. The other subgroup that we always keep track of is our special education population in district. As you can see on the 5-year chart, students who are on IEPs that are serviced in our K-12 buildings here in Belmont has gone up by 156 students over 5 years, and more importantly, over the last 3, 118 of those students additional, which means that currently in this school year, special education students make up 15% of our overall population versus just a few years ago, that was around 11%.
For both the English learners numbers and the special education numbers, they don't match the DOR numbers for students with disabilities or for EL learners. And I'm just curious as to what we're including that they're, or not including that they aren't, or what we are including that they're not including, or why there would be a difference in those. For example, the DOR single students with disabilities for 1021 was 502 for in-district, and it's 615 here. So I'm not sure what why there would be a difference.
The numbers that we are using are from the DESE portal that we receive.
Excuse me?
The numbers we are using are from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education.
That's what I'm using, the DESE. I'm sorry, DESE.
You said DIDO.
Well, I misspoke, DESE numbers, yeah.
So I don't know what the discrepancy is. These numbers were taken from that portal.
Okay, I'd just be interested in what the difference is for that and ELL too. Is the L number pre-K through 12 or just K through 12?
Pre-K through 12.
For both of these or for?
Pre-K through 12 for EL.
For EL and just K through 12 for?
K through 12
okay.
District.
Thanks.
Any other questions on this slide? Thank you, John.
Sure. The next slide we have is for our out-of-district population. These are students who receive services that would be only allowed to them outside of the Belmont Public Schools because we don't offer a similar program to meet their services. As you can see, this number has increased over time from 94 in 2018 all the way up to 130 in 2022. Most recently, in the last 3 years, it's gone up by 35 students.
John, the 1 year change is almost 30%. It's a huge percentage. Do you have a kind of insight as to what's driving that large single year-over-year increase?
I think we've had a lot of students come into school over the last 2 years from COVID, especially our younger students and students who transitioned grade levels that presented with substantial challenges and needs that we could only offer them in an outside placement.
John, last year there was a lot of trouble placing students that you thought needed this kind of, and how has that changed this year?
So the good news this year is that we have not, in the current school year that we're in, starting over the last 5 weeks, we've only had about 1 or 2 students that have gone out of placement or are getting ready to go out of placement, which, to your point, Ian, last year, between maybe the first day of school and the end of October, almost Thanksgiving, we had a queue of students that needed support services that were waiting in our schools because there was no placement. We do, and we are aware that we have spots available in our lab program at the moment, and also at several other schools that we work with. So that's the good news for us. The staffing levels finally came back to those schools. They had a hard time staffing their programs, which created less vacancies for students. And that seems to have progressed a little bit to our favor.
Yeah. The other thing is, last spring I did an analysis that I think I shared that showed that the our DESE numbers for students with disabilities had gone up by 17%. This would have been based on last year's numbers, not this year's numbers. And whereas all of the schools in the cohort that we compare ourselves to, with the exception of 1 or 2, had gone down over the period between 2020 and 2022. And I don't know if you've had a chance to look into that. Like, why would we be higher, go up so significantly, 17%, and other schools that are similar to us, Lexington, and all of the ones that you compare yourselves to, other than Hopkinton, which has an increase in enrollment for some reason, everyone's moving to Hopkinton. But why we would have, is that a difference in the way that we're looking at testing people, or I don't know why we would have such a change, and what that says about whether we need to, whether the resources we have are the correct resources or whatever. So
I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that our educators go through the same process that the state asks everyone to go through in determining whether someone is eligible for IEP services or not. That's a standard process. We utilize that process just like they do in all the other districts. And when families come in and have a team meeting, that team meeting is the controlling group that decides whether that student is eligible and walks through a flow chart, and the services are mandated to be provided to that student. So there's a state process that we follow very tightly.
Yeah,
so I don't know what's going on in other districts other than most students have qualified for that service.
Director Belmont, Chris has her name up, her hand up. Chris Doyle.
Hi, John. Thanks for this. Do you mind? Excuse me, Dave. Sorry, my husband's emptying the dishwasher. Sorry. I should be grateful, right? Do you have, and I don't, if you have this later on, just tell me to be quiet. Do you have the lab numbers? And also, is it possible at some point to show like a pie chart or something to show how the composition between like in-house services, lab, and OOD has changed like over the years? Because it is, obviously the 130 is really striking, and I'm wondering whether you alluded to staffing issues at lab, whether you think that drove some of the high numbers of OOD because of staffing at lab, or if those children need services that aren't provided by labs. So there's a few different questions embedded in there.
Sure. Just as a matter of baseline information, lab is considered an out-of-district placement. So our lab students
I'm
are
sorry.
embedded.
I was thinking of the, I was thinking the strict OOD as opposed to lab OOD. Okay, all right. So that's a huge, obviously a massive cost difference between lab and OOD. Okay.
Correct.
All right. How would you would you have a rough idea of the breakout, or is that something we need to come back with? We can come back with with the lab numbers versus private day placement versus overnight residential placement. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, John.
You're welcome, Chris.
Jack?
John, just to make sure I'm thinking about these numbers right, this 130 is not necessarily, once a student is an OOD student, similar to the EL comment that you made about assessment and transitioning back, the students, this can be a short-term, 1-year placement or whatever, so this number isn't necessarily going to be tied to enrollment trends. It acts kind of independently of enrollment trends. Is that a fair assessment? Once a student's in an OOD, they don't stay that way for all 8 years. So the number can bounce around independent of grade cohorts.
So just a framing comment. The questions now will start to become challenging to answer because we're talking about children. We're talking about children who need in Warrant unique services in order to address their challenges. Each of them has a unique reason as to why they're in an out-of-district placement. And to your point, Jack, we have a family who wanted to be back in Belmont and came in this year, and they're trying out the schools coming from an out-of-district placement because we wanted to make sure that they had the least restrictive environment possible, which is the law. And we want all of our students to be able to come back to Belmont if in fact, the services we can provide in our schools in district supports them. So it's true generically that yes, students can go out and get services, make such good gains that they can be scaffolded back into the district, and that's a good news story. So the answer to that question is yes.
It makes it more challenging for you to anticipate those future needs over the years because it's not necessarily driven by cohorts and numbers. It's driven by the characteristics and dynamics of 130 individual students.
Correct.
Okay.
Mark,
Dion has, I know, sorry. Chair, Elizabeth Dion.
I just wanted to make a comment in response to Jack's question. I actually am a special education attorney who represents low-income special needs children. Jack, once a child goes out of district, it's incredibly rare for them to come back in. And I won't go into all the reasons for that, but just understand that the law provides an awful lot of protections. And the team also becomes the team that dictates the services that the child gets. It's really out of the hands of the school district, the school committee, becomes school-based in that out-of-district placement. And so, I think we hope that circuit breaker alleviates a lot of the cost around that. But again, it's just really rare. A couple of other things. We don't control if a student's already out of district and the family moves into the district, after a year, we inherit that out of district placement. So, John can't speak to this because of confidentiality concerns, but we very well could have inherited some out of district placements that we didn't control and didn't make. I will just also add that Lab is hands down the best special education collaborative in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So we are incredibly, incredibly fortunate that we are able to access that particular service and set of placements.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Jeff.
Just building on your question too, Jack, I think what seems to be true over at least a 3-year period, if not longer, is that we have a higher percentage of students who have higher needs. And therefore, vis-a-vis the budget, it's more expensive to support them.
Of course.
Right, so that's true, right? And it's also happens that it's more unpredictable, right? Particularly as it relates to English learners who often move into town after the budget's been set. So that is a complexity that's facing all districts, but it seems to be facing us in our 4,400 student district in a kind of disproportionate way.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I have kind of a simplistic, way of analyzing, and I usually look at trend data. I mean, but the way you're describing the individual services provided, trend data is almost not usable. I mean, it's usable to some extent, but it's hard to draw trend lines because the needs change in addition to the numbers, and I think that creates a big challenge for a very big part of the budget.
Thank you. Should we move on?
The last slide that we have, a view of our vocational enrollment for FY '22 and '23. The community should know that we are no longer members of the Minuteman Regional High School. And so we do utilize Minuteman where we can, but we also have access to Medford Vocational Technical High School. This is the breakdown of students in the 21-22 school year, and also the bottom table shows the breakdown for the 22-23 school year.
John, if I might, I know you have a hand up here, but just maybe this is, not relevant to tonight's discussion, but in generally speaking, very familiar with Minuteman. We are, right, Jack? In terms of the type of education that they delivered, which was top shelf, clearly. The most expensive in the Commonwealth, but also top shelf. How does that compare to Medford? How does Medford compare to Minuteman?
I think both. Speaking, I think Minuteman is a fantastic option for our children. There's no doubt about it. And I think Medford has been open to us, which we appreciate, and our students like it there who go there. They get transportation there. We are working and have worked with Cambridge Ringe and Latin has a vocational program that we may soon open up.
Waltham as well, I think.
And Waltham is beginning to create vocational space in Watertown's new high school will have vocational space. So we have some options to be able to tap into that I especially am very excited about the Watertown programming, who are very open to receiving Belmont.
I'm just curious on that.
No,
I know you had your hand up here, but
I just wanted to say really quickly to Mark that, these programs are not all comparable. So some have a suite of programs that may be attractive and suitable for a student, whereas some others may not. And so, as more of these kinds of programs become accessible to us, that actually increases our options.
Okay. Do folks choose Medford or they go to Medford because there's no seats in Minuteman?
I don't know the answer. I think that most people apply to both. We have both schools out to the middle school to meet the families and meet the students. We make sure we do that. I believe vocational options for students is really, really important. And we want to make sure our parents have that choice. And so we would like to encourage every family to take it.
Both schools are able to come and speak to our students?
Yes, absolutely.
8th grade?
Yep.
Okay, great. Ian?
I was just wondering about whether you've identified any particular reason for the overall decline. Like if you look at sort of grade 10 and 11 between last year and this year, there's a significant difference. And is it the new high school? Are people opting to stay in our shiny new high school? Or, do you know that, I just wondered why the earlier years, which were, had a significant more number of people, would you have any reason for that? Or know of any reason why?
It doesn't show applicants, right? I mean, there could have been more applicants.
It doesn't show applicants, and I don't know the reason for the decline in the enrollment, other than the fact that we graduated 10 and didn't take any in at Minuteman, so that's a fallout on the other side. So, and I do believe that our high school programming, when it becomes fully implemented in September of '23, has more hands-on like classrooms and settings for students to be able to learn by doing, but it will not replace a traditional vocational program where you can learn a trade. So I think the students who may be on the fence can stay in Belmont, and that was the intent of that programming that we put in place. But we encourage everybody who wants to be in a trade to apply out to a vocational school.
If I could, just for context, I spent a good amount of time looking at the Minuteman budget when I was working in Lexington, who they are a member community still, and I attended several of the the Minuteman budget hearings, and they were reporting that they were having such demand for the new building that they were only able to admit the member communities. And so what you're seeing is that the enrollment is going down at Minuteman in grades 9 and 10.
They're not opting for a different program really here. I mean, maybe some to Medford, but that's why I was wondering. They have a shiny new building too, but it's not, it doesn't,
The number of in-district schools has reduced from 16 to, what is it, 9?
9, yeah.
You're saying that more students from those district schools are applying to Minuteman with the new high school?
I do believe that the number of, they had to reduce the size of their school as well, so that ended up making it a little bit challenging. They've been expanding it.
School, right?
600.
Okay, I'm sorry, Jennifer. Yeah.
So Jennifer, are you saying that if some child opts out of Minuteman, let's say in grade 10, that they replace them with someone from a member district as opposed to bringing in somebody from Warrant?
I can't answer that.
Member towns have priority over non-member towns on enrollment at Minuteman. I believe that applies to every grade.
12 people left in grades 10 and 11, they would first choose from their member wing.
Correct. Satisfy the 9 remaining district schools. We were one of them at one point, Bill, in terms of their enrollment requirements. Once that's been completed, then they entertain applications from out-of-district schools.
Enrollment.
We do it work.
So being down in Minuteman is not a surprise.
So for years and years and years, as far as I can remember, in district schools, even at 16, the number of students were less than what an 800-member school would accommodate. That was the whole debate. So a lot of the students were out of district.
Just to put it in historical context, because we looked at this
where we had a bunch of data on how many kids applied and if they got in or not, and if they went somewhere else. And so I just would maybe put a bookmark in the idea at some other meeting of having a bunch of data on this topic to help the conversation.
That's fine, Chris. Thank you. Any other questions on the slide? John?
This is Aaron over the internet. I was just going to say, for the structural change impact group, I wrote a report on this. I talked to Mr. Lambert, who's been working on this for the district. He told me that there were fewer applicants and fewer kids accepted. No kids accepted at Minuteman because it was full. And that's why we have students at Medford, because Medford agreed to take our students who were interested. So just for, that sort of corroborates what other people have speculated and said in the meeting here.
Thank you, Aaron. John? Next slides.
So the other part of the presentation that both Patrice and I will go through is just a general overview of the budget process for looking how we will look at FY24. The content of the next 3 slides is taken directly from the FY24 budget process memo that I sent out to the school committee, and we presented on it at our school committee, I believe, on October 4th, and sent to the Warrant Committee, and went over this with the Warrant Committee Subcommittee for Education, the longest title in committee helmet history. So we're going to look at the budget this year in 3 different lenses, through 3 different lenses, in order to separate conversations and then bring the budget together as one budget. The first lens of the budget that we will go through is the general fund budget. We will do what we do every year, which is we'll roll over our head count for the current year, roll it into FY24. The small pieces of that folks may not understand is that there may be folks who are on leave this year that are coming back next year and may be currently filled with an employee that makes less. So we always want to budget the person who's actually going to be here in FY24. So there are some small adjustments underneath, just not rolling everybody over. But in essence, we're taking every employee and bringing them forward, and we're applying the cost of living allowance, the steps and the lanes that go with that employee, and coming up with what we're calling a gross dollar amount for general fund. The district will review those staffing levels by grade and by level of the district to make sure that whatever level services we're offering are part of what we're already doing this year, and does that make sense for what we're moving into next year, then that will produce a net dollar amount. So there'll be a gross dollar amount that we'll provide, and we're actually going to have a meeting next Tuesday night for those who are watching in this room. There is an off-cycle budget meeting of the school committee where we'll go over this process in some detail to start this process. So the net deductions or the net adds will not be part of next Tuesday. We're starting the process off with what it costs to just roll over the folks from this year into fiscal 24.
Jeff has a question. Just a quick question. When we did the work with the financial task force too, and working with Tony and you and the task force, we sort of set a benchmark or guideline of a rollover around 4% when we would for budgeting processes. And it was Roy grabbed the tables, the employment tables that Tony provided, and we came up with this calculation. I understand that number was a guideline set a couple of years ago, but it'll be interesting to know what that number is going to be. Because also the COLAs are now, how does that impact with the new bargaining agreement?
So just to address the bargaining agreement, we entered into a 4-year agreement with our unions, all 4 of them, and actually with ASME, which would be number 5. We have increased our COLA by 2.75% for last year, with a 2.5% addition for only those in the highest step. In the second year was a 2.75% raise for those in the highest step and 2.5 for those not in the highest step, and then 2.5 for everybody and 2.5 for the general population. And I'm not sure, Jeff, if you're alluding to Roy's work with staff exchange as it relates to the subject.
Yes. So I think it would be useful to have Tony give us the same data this year that he gave us in January of 2021 to see how the 4% budgeting amount based on the historical, or I would say the expected roll forward, and whether that's still a good assumption.
So we will, I'll talk to Tony about that part of the calculation. That won't be something that we'll be sharing on Tuesday night. And I would also suggest, and we've had this conversation internally, that if the schools are going to address staff exchange as a reduction in their budget, we would expect that the town have a staff exchange number in their budget. We returned in our salary back to the town somewhere around $600,000. The town returns $600,000 in their staffing level, and we have more employees than they do. Well, so but I just want to say, while we get to expectations around this, I just want to be very clear that if we're going to reduce our budget again by an amount of money related to staff exchange, I would expect that to be a consistent process for both the town and the schools, considering that the give back towards free cash.
I think we're diving into the expense side of the equation here, and we try to keep it to the revenue side. But it's a request for next time, right?
It's raised on this bullet side.
Well, you're asking for information to be provided for future meetings.
I brought it up as we discussed the financial task force. We should just recalibrate. I don't know which direction it should go, and it was a number that we were going to just talk.
But is that something that we're looking for?
That's part of the process.
It's October. We're not going to know that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I mean, I can appreciate John's point, but I think the other thing that people need to realize, and it's in a later slide, is the town eliminated 5 positions in FY22. So we're already not providing a level service budget based on what we had provided previously. We eliminated a firefighter, a police officer, 2 DPW laborers, and a town engineer. So we are not proposing those be reinstated, and until those are reinstated, I think the town is looking to just kind of provide the level of services that we're able to provide at this point in time.
Okay. Other questions? Chris, you have your hand up. I think it's from the last slide, right? Chris Doyle. Okay, John, next slide.
The next lens into the budget is...
This is Matt Taylor. Can I ask a question?
Oh, Matt, I didn't see your hand up. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes, please.
Yeah, no problem.
So I think this discussion is really helpful. I really appreciate all the work and thought that has gone into talking about the schools and the changing demographics and challenges. I think it really underscores how tricky it is to plan these things and to communicate them. Please humor me here because this point is really important. And I think these slides have shown our school's commitment to identifying and working to meet the needs of our students and their families. When we talk about level services, and here I'm referring to the second bullet point, we sometimes use level services in two different ways. And as an educating body, I think the Warrant Committee and just more broadly the community is very confused and doesn't look at this in a consistent way. We sometimes use level service to mean we did the same thing as last year. And, you know, I hear this from every point of view in town. You know, families and children relying on services from our schools will point to the cuts in classes, you know, math tutors, French 1, you know, trip to DC, so forth, right? It's very understandable that they would be confused and say, hey, that's not level service, right? They're getting something different, and to them it feels less than what they got the year before. Now, I want to contrast this with the second way we use level services, and your slides, John, were a great example of this. You know, the school has committed to identifying and working to meet the needs of groups of students, and the nature of that group has grown. And so we sometimes use level service to mean we will provide the same quality or nature of service as last year to everyone who earns it or has that right or fits a certain criteria. And that group has grown. So in this case, the budget needs to grow to provide level service to those students. Now, I hear this again, same kind of confusion, right? People who are suspicious of our schools, the budget, our budgeting process. They point to the smaller class sizes, more employees, but fewer students, and they're understandably confused. That's not level service. This is the second case, right? And so when we're talking about the school budget, it is really, really important that we educate our community and we back it with data on what we mean when we say level service. Are we using it in the first case? We will do the same as last year. Or are we using it in the second case where we are providing a standard and we will meet that standard to everyone who has earned it or meets the criteria? And we need to show that with data. And I think, you know, more honestly, you know, because of all the thought and the dynamism that goes into the budget forward, this is a very loaded term that leads people to be very mad and confused because to them, none of it feels like level service. It feels like an improvement. It feels like growth. It feels like a cut, but none of it feels level because the situation on the ground is changing and requires a lot of thought. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and how we can support this stuff with data because people are going to be mad as we go through this process. Thank you.
So, Matt, I think this is actually a conversation that Patrice and I were talking about. What is the definition of level service that we want to use as a town? I can say generally that as a school superintendent, I see level service as the second example you gave, which is we need to provide the same level of service to students this year that we will to whatever that cohort looks like next year. So that means if any one cohort grows or any one need grows, the same resources might not be able to provide the same level of service if we have X amount of more students in IEPs or X amount of more students who deserve and need some other kind of function. So that's generally what level service means. In contrast to that, what it also means is that if we have a kindergarten class that is historically lower in number, and we've had class size of, say, 17, and we say, well, you know what, we can reduce a staff member and still provide level service at 19 per class. So even a reduction of FTE can maintain reasonable level service in that example. And potentially an addition of a special educator or an EL instructor or another type of service might need to be added just to maintain level service under your second definition.
That helpful, Matt?
Yeah, so John, I really appreciate that answer. And I think you've basically mirrored my point that we're using it two different ways. If we're going to, like, I love your point about class size, right? Like, there's, it's the same thing with like dollars per student. Like, the details matter, the people matter. There is no like one line that rules it all and is a magical threshold. But and so, like, use class sizes as an example, I think of it's an educator-driven teaching style, right? Here's the style that we want to enable. We want to enable small group sessions, and small group sessions are students, groups of say 3 to 5 students. And so if you have 20 students, then you can do 4 groups. But if you have 21 or 22 students, you can no longer do four groups with the same level of service. The English language learners changing in the classroom, right? It's about level of service. So we need to back this not just with data, but to show people, like, if you have class standards like that, and we can show the demographics and like what changed from year to year. I'm getting this. Are people who are suspicious of the school budget, the people who are afraid that, and they're saying, hey, this stuff was cut, right? We cut the 5th grade language program. That's not level service to the people who were looking forward to that, right? We're cutting the trip to DC. That's not level service to the people who are looking forward to going to DC. So, it's like we're going to get picked apart if we don't back this up with data and help people understand in our budgeting process. We're taking the previous year's budget, we're carrying it forward and thoughtfully tweaking it based on the needs of the students so that we're meeting the needs of the community where they are. And that's
so, Matt, let me just stop you there for a moment. I mean, I think you need to apply that to other departments as well, right? So how do you define level services within public safety, public health, DPW, and others? And that's always a challenge for us, right? I mean, public safety services, how do you measure that and back that up with data? Because crime changes, right? The need for fire protection and police protection may change year to year. And so the challenge that's always been is like, what does that mean? It's a good point to say, what does level service mean? And I've been doing this for quite some time, and it's challenging because the delivery of that service changes over time, meaning that what you need for public safety today is not what you needed for public safety 20 years ago. It just changes. And so I think we need to wrestle with and communicate more and articulate more clearly to the community. And the way I look at this, Matt, is, from my point of view, is there's an expectation that our residents, all of us who are residents, expect in terms of service delivery. To me, that's a level service delivery model, meaning that this is what the residents expect, and we do our best to try to deliver the services that they anticipate and expect from us, not only within the schools, but within the other town departments as well. It's really hard to sort of look at that and say, how does the data support that? But it's a fair point to try to be more articulate and clear about what does that mean? Because I think it's a word that we use that is not as clearly defined as it needs to be.
And I agree with you, Mark. This is not just specific to the schools. I agree. It's a really challenging question. I also think that we are the people, and the Warrant Committee as an educating body, as the school committee decides how it wants to move forward in data-driven decision making and how the schools will execute on that. But we're going to have to make a lot of painful decisions going forward in these coming years. And the more we can do to educate people about the thought and the trade-offs they're going. I heard someone comment to me, a neighbor, also a town meeting member, kind of said, hey, I went to town meeting and it felt like all the decisions had already been made. And I get it. Like, it can feel that way, but there's also a ton of work and thought that goes in, like, leading up to that. Like, a lot of those have already been said. And I, like, as an educating body, if the Warrant Committee is going to help town meeting understand these appropriations and whether, like, this is a just right school budget, the difficult decisions have been made, the thought of how do we meet the needs of the students and the changing nature of the, like, what's on the ground. And how do we show that? It's not just enough for us to be precise. We have to be accessible and intuitive. And the thing that I'm seeing over and over again from our community, and I'm hearing from our community, is they conclude opposite things, right? There's cuts or there's growth, or hey, this was a problem before, but now we fixed it. We used to have the class sizes were too big, but now they're not too big. So finally, but they're all going, but that's not level service. And we're the group that needs to step up, not just this
year. Matt, I'm agreeing with you.
Next year is that we're going to do the work to explain this and show this to the community so that they can understand that we're doing the best we can for our community and our future.
I think that's right, Matt. And what I would say to you is that, unfortunately, a lot of folks just don't pay attention until the very end. And so one of the things that we wanted to do this year as this sort of revised budget approach is have these budget summits. And there's 10 people, outside of the panelists that are watching tonight, and appreciate and thank them for tuning in. But many times, a lot of town meeting members don't focus on this until the very end. And all of this work has gone into that. The Warrant Committee, having served for 6 years, is a significant lift. You guys are meeting in subcommittee meetings. There's all kinds of meetings that take place up until the point in which the Warrant Committee prepares its incredibly well-written report. A lot of effort that goes into that. That is a report that everyone should read that wants to know about our budget. We're trying to be more accessible. We're trying to over-communicate. I think the Warrant Committee has, done, that really well over the last few years here. We'll continue to do that. But at the end of the day, Matt, there are some folks in our community, town meeting members, that don't pay attention until the town meeting is convened. So I'm not sure what we can do about that. But we'll do our very best and continue to sort of be articulate and clear about, what we're doing from a budget perspective. And so with that, I think Ann had her hand up and Chris had her hand. Are you all done?
Yeah, I was just going to say,
Ann had her hand up, and Chris Doyle, I'll recognize you after Ann. Go ahead, Ann.
All right, I believe in providing data too, and I just wanted to point out the school committee or school department did do an analysis of their ELL and the weighted service per student, and that's very helpful for helping people understand, what the needs may be or may not be.
That's right. Thank you, Chris. Chris Doyle.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that I'm hoping that with the town's more, this budget process, which is getting moved back, and now that we have, we just, building more capacity, if you will, on the, that it will lead, after this year to, Patrice is probably roll her eyes, but, she's heard me make noise about having a budget that has more measurements in it. And I think that's, Mark, perfectly possible on the non-school side. It's perfectly possible to talk about, fire department calls, the nature of the calls, what kind of staffing is required that's changed, police calls, unlike children moving into the district who need an out of district placement, roads don't move, right? It's a static thing. But so there's a lot of data that we can have, and I'm hoping that the next round of the budget after this round, we'll be able to integrate more of that into it. Matt's making a really important point on the school side in terms of all of those things he's talking about. My kids had 5th grade language. They went on the DC trip, and now, I didn't even know the DC trip had been eliminated. I knew 5th grade language had been eliminated. So there is a different package of services on the school side, and it's important to be honest with people about what is and isn't in it.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Great points. Really appreciate that. John, next slide.
Sure. So the second lens that we want to look through the budget from FY23 to FY24 is the federally funded positions. We have a total of 16.67 Unit A, Unit B, and Unit D positions. And what I mean by Unit A, B, and D is A is teacher, not a classroom teacher, but someone who's a professional person with a certification. Unit D member is a paraprofessional, and a Unit B member would be an administrator. Currently, we have 16.67 of those federally funded positions that we have with us right now. They are projected into next year. If we were to have them in place in their entirety, it would be, right now the cost is $1.2 million. It's funded with federal dollars. That amount would be $1.29 million if they were all to go forward. We are looking to roll that number over, and also, as a second part of this conversation, talk about what we think that we could use for the next year related to these services. Just a side point, as I look at the list of these positions, none of these positions are classroom teachers. These are nurses, social workers, math specialists, building substitutes, transition room, special educator for students who are coming back from medical into a mental health needs, in Medco aides. So these are not traditional classroom teachers. They're actually the support services that surround students and classroom teachers. So we will look at that. We understand that the federal money that the schools have used over the last 2 years will be depleted at the end of fiscal 23, but we want to go through this exercise to make sure that if there are any needs still remaining, to Jeff's Liberty's point earlier, some of these needs that came forward during COVID and as we emerge from COVID do still exist, and whether or not these positions can continue will be a conversation. So we will have a net number of those positions that we would ultimately talk about as we move into the second phase of our budget conversation. Any conversation about the federal fund slide?
John, just the flip, I assume the opposite is true too. When you do that analysis, you will be making an assessment as to what needs were really COVID-driven and transitionary, and you no longer need to provide those services, even though it's a level service budget.
Yes.
Fair. Great.
Thank you. Slide.
Sure. The next slide is the third lens, which is, as you know, we'll be opening the Belmont Middle High School in its entirety in September of 23. We are adding a 7th school to the Belmont Public School District. This will come with the inherent increase in FTEs related to having a separate building with its own administration, its own custodians, its own administrative support. The majority of the positions that will fill this school are existing educators and staff members who work with 7th and 8th graders right now at our middle school, and they will all move up. There is, however, a disconomy of scales going on here where we're being temporarily a little less efficient if we keep everybody the same, because we're spreading the same amount of employees across 7 buildings versus right now we're spreading them across 6 buildings. So we really have to be thoughtful about what the impact of that could be. It will increase the staffing level of the Belmont Public Schools to open a 7th school. So we will net that out. What we've done and what you'll see on Tuesday night, this is a teaser for everybody to come on Tuesday night. We have basically made an is it a trailer or a teaser? I thought it was a video, it was like a teaser.
Yeah, I don't know.
Trailer.
Yeah.
I think a Rex when I think of trailer. I think a Rex trailer. Again, this audience is too young for that reference.
I remember.
We've made an organizational chart of every single level of the district. So we have an elementary organizational chart that shows every position in each grade, in each building. We have a middle school chart and a high school chart with every position in the building. We take that middle school chart and we divide it into a 5-6 school for next year, and then who will go up for the 7th and 8th grade school for next year. And you can actually start to see, and it's color-coded, you can actually see as we break it apart that there's some inherent needs that will be part of that process that will be staff and headcount related. So we will show a process-like slide on Tuesday night so people can get that visual conceptual view of what that will look like. And then we will start to talk about what the actual FTE increase that will come with that as we begin to unpack it. This is a topic that will come with a lot of discussion about what's the schedule for the school and how does that impact FTE, how the schedule works, and can staff still travel from one school to the next if they're shared staff. So there's a lot of underpinnings of this that we're working on with our educators. We've had great meetings so far this year in order to come up with that schedule in a way that works for students, for all grades 7 through 12. And but there will be a number associated with this. So as we pause, we have 3 buckets now that we'll have. We'll have a gross number for general fund and then a net number. We'll have a gross fund number amount for federal funds, and we'll have a net number that we'll put forward. We don't have a number from last year for the new school because it's not in place yet. So we'll have a net number for what we think it takes to staff the school. And that will be the 3rd number. So now we'll be able to see each of these in their isolation, and then we'll add them up at the end for, what we consider to be the bulk of what the ask is in the budget related to staffing our schools.
John, use kind of simplified hypotheticals. If you have 2 staff now serving 5 to 8, and one does job function A and one does job function B. Are there opportunities as you transition to have one person do job function A and B at the high school for the 7th and 8th graders, and another person do job function A and B at the lower level, so that you're not adding staff, you're reallocating the responsibilities, so that the individual people expand their responsibility for a smaller pool of students.
So we are reviewing exactly that type of effectiveness of use of resources at the 7 through 12 school, and at for next year, the 5-6 school, that in the following fiscal year will become a 4-5-6 school. So the same exercise that we're going through this year in terms of dividing staff and reallocating the resources of our colleagues in different places will happen this year in a larger way, and then in a smaller scale, and we do with our 4th grade, moving that up to the 4, 5, 6 upper elementary in fiscal 25. And we are examining every and any efficiency that we get by having adults in one 7 through 12 building that we can really look at differently now, because they're all in one building. Some of those will be efficiencies that will be really neat, like we have music staff, for example, that right now teach at Chenery and at the high school. Well, all of their students will be at the high school now, or the middle high school. So there's efficiencies there. So this will come with efficiencies and inefficiencies and adds and subtracts. And so that net number will bring out to everybody as best we know it.
Other questions on that slide? Next.
The last chunk of the budget that we wanted to make sure we looked at as part of our work, which we do each year at the Warrant Committee, which we'd like to do in December. So from Warrant Committee members who are on the Ed Subcommittee to the School Committee, we'd like to do our Circuit Breaker 101 meeting, and then talk about our 3-year plan and discuss what we consider to be the anticipated circuit breaker dollars, lab credits, and IDEA dollars related to what our expenses are and our projected enrollment may be and our projected revenue will be. This is our 3-year out-of-district plan that we go over each year. And instead of having this conversation in April, May, and June, we want to have it in December, so that number is settled in part of the budget planning for our meeting in January, when we'll have an overarching budget for the district. So we look forward to having that annual discussion and kind of checking it off the list earlier in the season.
Right.
So it's no longer something that we have to worry about.
That's great. That's terrific, John. Thank you. Absolutely. Well done. Any questions on this? Well done. Thank you. Appreciate that approach and sense to approach it in the way that you just. Thank you.
Mark, if I could just,
Of course,
it's a
Meg.
tremendous amount of work for the staffing and figuring out who goes where and trying to create efficiencies, and just the administration, John and others. It's a tremendous amount of work going into it right now.
John, Tony, and
Carla Koza, Mike McAllister, and Janice, but it's a tremendous amount of work that they're doing.
It is a tremendous.
It's good it's the only thing you're doing, right?
Right.
That's correct. Exactly. So to operate in the school every day. So thank you for saying that, Meg. Thank you, John. I appreciate that and all the work that your team has done, and Tony and everyone else.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think, Jennifer, you're going to cover the next couple of slides here.
Yes, so just to continue to save Patrice's voice, we will just briefly go over the municipal budget process. It's very similar to what we've been doing in the past, with a couple of refinements. As Patrice noted, we are not proposing to restore those 5 positions that were eliminated in FY22 after the failed override, and she spoke to those earlier. One thing that I'm very excited about is that we've started doing central payroll projections for our overall budget. I need to give huge kudos to Matt Haskell for taking that on. Yes, that's been a huge help. It's going to help our office in terms of projecting collective bargaining increases, confirming what further increases are, and ensuring consistency across all the departments for their payroll funding needs. And if I could, as part of that, the staff exchange at the schools is not immediately, it's hard to kind of come up with an exact variable that, or, you know, an exact parallel relating to that, but one thing that where we do have a number of vacancies that are on staff, that are not on staff right now, and rather than continuing to project their salary at the levels of the people that were on staff previously, we're projecting an entry-level position. So that's our version of staff exchange, I would suggest. Jack, if I could just hold your position.
Yeah, Jack, can we just go through the slide first and then you can ask a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So, you know, we are requesting a level, we're presenting or projecting FY24 expenses based on level services from FY23. And then what we're also doing is we're starting to capture what we're projecting for FY25 and FY26. This is going to be both at the payroll and at the expenses levels. And what that does is the intent is to help us as we're doing our refinements for our multi-year budget projections, so that if we know that there are some larger cost drivers, we can start to build those into our projections. So it's not that we're going to necessarily use those to the penny for our projections, but it's certainly going to be helping to add to our analysis. So we're looking forward to seeing what comes back from departments and kind of further refining and sharpening our pencils on that. We have a deadline of next Friday for departments to be submitting this to us, and then we're going to be taking a look and reviewing them, and then starting our initial internal meetings on the week of November 14th. We did just send that schedule to Jeff for the Warrant Committee's subcommittee members to attend as they are able, just a small smattering of them, you know, so that they're getting a sense of the conversations. And then the select board budget hearings are going to be scheduled the week of December 5th. And Jeff noted that the Warrant Committee subcommittees are planning to meet with the departments per usual in February and March, and developing their Warrant Committee report in May.
Just on the issue of staff exchange or turnover, as part of the chorus who has been beating up on the school department for years on this, I would submit that, as imperfect as it is, you can make some general assumptions that X% of our staff leave in any given year, and the replacements are hired at Y% of the previous salary, and have an estimate for what that turnover is. It's more than just saying the open positions today will be filled at lower salary. There's it's a projection, it's a number, but there's a factor in there. If the same dynamic is true, that people who leave tend to be replaced by lower staff, it's, I think, appropriate for us to budget that on both the school side and the town side. We could be wrong about the number, but by ignoring it, we are overstating our costs.
But I would say, Jack, that if you want to take data, and we can look at data to do some of this, the turnover on the town side, maybe not as of late, because it's an anomaly right now, but the turnover on the town side versus the turnover on the school side annually, you'll see a vast difference.
Yeah, it's not a value judgment. I'm just talking about the methodology, that there's a methodology there that I think can be applied to both sides of the budget.
You want that trend to sort of project out in 25 and 26? Is that the point? Is that why we?
Well, I just think we're, by not doing it, we increase turnbacks, which raise, our free cash. But I think
the budget,
but we are by not factoring that in, we are overstating our likely costs every year, and we've been saying that to the state for years, and they.
Right. Roy.
Jack, that's exactly the analysis that Jeff and I did 2 years ago. And I think it's appropriate to do it every year to see where you land.
Yep.
And I would just add, the concern I might have is the job market is extremely tight. It might actually be the opposite. You're replacing people with more expensive because you need to attract that talent.
Yep.
Well, it's going to have vacancies because you can't hire people.
We're finding that in community development. We've been challenged. I've talked to Glenn. HR, We have 4 positions in community development we're looking to fill. We're not getting really great applicants. Same with HR. And so, if you read articles that GFO has put out, I mean, it's really tightening. The job market is really tight, even in the municipal arena as well, and qualified individuals. So it's going to be a challenge going forward. Jeff and Chris had our hand up as well. Bill, you got your hand up? I'm sorry.
I just want to say, as someone who has hired a lot of teachers and has gone into a season of hiring with some trepidation about the quality and qualifications of candidates I might choose, I have also operated under different budgetary constraints where I've had actual or average salaries to work with depending on the type of school I was leading. So I have a lot of experience in this area. What I would say is, I think conceptually it's good to have models. It's good to learn from the past. What's not so good, if we say, is if we lock the school department into a situation where they can't hire somebody with a PhD who's the ideal candidate for our children, right? And so I think there needs to be some wiggle room in terms of what a position actually costs, such that we don't have to turn away the most qualified. I would say that's true on the town side also, by the way.
Yes.
Right? So I think that's sort of like, from the math side, it all makes sense, right? If you're just thinking about them as numbers, but if you think about them as positions and people who serve our kids, and you look at the context that we're in that we've just now named, which is the labor market, which is very tight for educators. I want to make sure that the sort of like process improvements we're making don't have bad outcomes for kids. That's where I stand on the issue, right? Because it's not worth doing if you make a process improvement, but if you don't get good teachers. That's really what it comes down to.
Bill. So Jack, what you're talking about, I think is something that I've been involved in all my budgeting, over the many years is, you take your budget, you take your staffing levels that you expect. You start with actuals maybe, and you project out what you think you're going to need and when, and that's your plan. That's what you would like to achieve. But then down below, you have some sort of understanding that you're not going to have all those people all the time. So you have a vacancy rate, and how you come up with. They're two separate things, really. There's the top line of your personnel positions, your head count, your FTE, and the dollars that's going to cost. And I've always done it by month, and maybe that's more detailed than we do here. But then you have another variable down below that's a vacancy rate. And the key, Jeff, is you're talking about, it's a process. You have to manage it every month, and you have to report out on it.
Yes.
And when it comes time to face that challenge of, gee, we need to hire 2 people, but how are we going to do that given these constraints? Because that's what they are. You have to figure out where you're going to move stuff around, so to speak, in order to accomplish whatever the priority is. Maybe you can accomplish all those priorities every year. Maybe you can't. Maybe you're going to have good surprises in your vacancy rate versus, bad surprises. Maybe your vacancy rate will be too high. And in actuality, more people will stick around. But it is a process. You have to manage that process every month. And I think that's sort of, we're doing a budget process here, but I think it goes beyond that. It's all year long. We have to look at it.
Yeah. Points, Bill. Thank you. Chris.
Yeah, I had one note of thanks and one question. Oh, hi. Yeah, my note of thanks is to Matt. I heard he's taking on central payroll projection. I would submit that having someone do that is the first step in us being able to budget salary savings, which is what I think Bill and Jack were describing. So Matt, kudos to you and thanks for doing that project. And then I just wanted to say that I didn't hear anything about structural change in the description of the budget process, the structural change impact report, and ask that every town department head and even the people below the department head be given the report and required to look at the sections related to their area and to report back as part of their budget process which of the recommendations they can or for whatever reason can't implement. And so I would that would be one tool in sort of trying to push out all the tremendous amount of work and information that was embedded that report, is to integrate that as part of the budget process. So I would make that as a question and a request.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. So I think that maybe down the line, that's a goal that maybe the town can kind of put out there for itself. I can tell you right now that my department heads are bare bones staff. I have department heads doing invoices. I have department heads doing payroll. I have department heads that do not have the staff underneath them because of vacancies, because of loss of positions due to the failed override. I have staff that is completely burnt out, and it is my job every day to try and retain staff that we currently have. That is my number one goal going into the town, is to retain the staff that we have, and then eventually bring in more staff with the vacancies. I think it's a great idea, Chris. I would love to be able to have the opportunity for my department heads to take the time to do that. They do not have the time right now. I can't tell you how many department heads I've already talked to over the past week that know that their budget is due next week, and they're having a hard time just getting time to sit down and just to look at, a level service budget for next year. So I want people to understand that the department heads are doing the very best they can with the very limited amount of staff to get their work done on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, Patrice. Mike.
Well, so it's sort of a related question, but the 5 positions that were eliminated on the town side in fiscal 22, at any point in this process, will there be an evaluation of whether those positions or some portion of those positions are truly needed, and we would be doing ourselves a disservice to not consider adding some of those back?
Well, I was going to thank you for mentioning that point, because I think that's the initial, but I think the select board the week of the 5th will try to understand whether this 5 reduction that we have from 22, we continue to provide the type of police, fire, and other services that we've historically provided.
I think if I could also, one thing that I neglected to add on here, I'm glad that the opportunity, thank you for asking the question. One other aspect that we're adding to the process this year is a new element called a program improvement request. So we're asking departments to submit level service budgets. But then if they would like to advocate on behalf of additional investments, they're given the opportunity to do that, but they also recognize that those are not necessarily going to be funded. So that then provides the select board a mechanism to be able to review those and make a further determination.
Thank you, Michael, for that. I just want to comment on Chris's point about the structural change impact group having served on it, and we're trying to lift off the ground the structural change implementation for a group, whatever it's called now. And we haven't gotten the applicants that we need. And so it's not a report we want to shelve, Chris, clearly. I mean, there are really good ideas in there. Some are short-term wins, and there are longer-term wins, and we're not going to ignore them. And so Patrice is right. We're really tight, and I'm concerned. The board is concerned about folks that have left. Pretty much, we've lost a lot of folks in community development, our department, and other departments. And so we're going to do our best to continue to hire for those positions, but short and long term. We do need to look at the structural change impact group recommendations, because it's salient to the point I made earlier. It's a way to look at how we deliver services in a different way, more efficient way perhaps, and save money. So that work is ongoing, and it's not going to be, I want the viewing audience to understand that we're really tight this year. We're trying to do our best to get a budget in place, but the structural change impact group recommendations are not shelved. We're going to continue to look at those. Elizabeth. Dion.
Thank you. I just wanted to chime in as both co-chair of the General Government Subcommittee and also chair of the Community Preservation Committee. For a number of years now, I've met and worked on a regular basis with town staff. I want to echo Patrice's point that they're understaffed, they're overworked. They're very dedicated to the work they do for the town, but increasingly it just seems like we're placing an unfair burden on them. And I know that we have struggles between the school side budget versus the town budget. And it's just a challenge. We're dealing with a zero-sum budget. There is not more money available to us right now. But I just really want to echo the point in speaking with one of the department heads last week, talked about losing some more staff to Newton because they were paying $3 more an hour than we were. At a certain point, do we lose enough people that the Jenga puzzle comes tumbling down? I am deeply concerned. I've seen this for a number of years. And so I'm not offering a solution. I am just validating what both Mark and Patrice have just said.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Paul, Victor.
So I just wanted to chime in on the structural change implementation committee idea, which I've been pushing for a year, and I'll be serving on it once we get off the ground. And just to make sure the public, I guess, listening understands that I think I've realized working on the structural change impact group was that it was going to be very difficult to implement many of the ideas without somebody pushing them forward. So that's the goal of this the committee can't implement anything, but the committee can make sure things don't get forgotten and to make sure to the degree that there are staff resources that could be spent on things, implementing the ideas in the report, there needs to be somebody pushing it. And that's the goal. So hopefully we can get off the ground soon.
And Paul, and I want to thank you as well. It was your idea. We put it in the report. The chair put it, Travis Frank put it in the report. You originated it. It's a great idea because it's a separate sort of committee, if you will. I know you have a pretty significant lift as it stands with being on the Warrant Committee. To sort of continue to look at that and move that forward in an incremental way and to leverage the town administrator, our town department heads, and the select board, frankly, and trying to move those things forward. I mean, you and I have talked quite a bit about a lot of things we did. Some of the things we did, not quite as much as we needed to, is to talk to other communities. We need to continue to do that because I think that to result in some fruitful and productive discussions about how we can share resources and enter into intermunicipal agreements with other towns. And I think the group that hopefully we get off the ground and perhaps you'll chair, we'll continue to move that forward. Let's continue to participate as well. So I appreciate your commitment on that.
And Mark, just so you understand, the select board is one of the groups that implementation committee is going to be going to talk to you
without
about
question,
ideas
Paul,
that need to be implemented.
It's sort of like making certain, and we're committed to it, making certain that we don't lose sight of that report and the need to continue to sort of roll the ball down the hill, if you will, in whatever way we can to look at these ideas, because there were over 400, if I recall. Very articulate, committee was incredibly talented committee. It really was, and the lift was significant. We're not going to lose sight of that. The select board is, I'll speak on behalf of my colleagues, we are committed to continuing to move those forward. Okay, next slide.
Mark?
Oh, yeah, Chris.
I just want to mention that no one has to read all 400 of those. They can go to the extraordinarily handy spreadsheet that sorts. Yeah, it's extraordinary, and it's sorted all by how hard or easy they are to implement. No one has to read 400 of them. It's very easy.
Well, I've read all 400, but you're right. The
I know, but very busy department heads, don't need to.
Right.
Very busy department heads don't need to read 400.
Not sure anyone reads them, though.
Yeah. Is that Ian?
I'm not sure anyone reads them, though.
What? The department heads?
What she was talking about, the 400 ideas, I thought.
No one has to read the 400 ideas. They can just use the extraordinary.
And Ian was a part of that, and she came up with a lot of terrific ideas. No, Chris, we get the point. Thank you.
So for the capital budget, we are in a transition year where we are transitioning from the long-standing capital committee and the short-term,
long-term plan.
Long-term capital.
Thank you, yes. And into the comprehensive capital budget committee, which is still in the process of forming. But we have had conversations with departments about their requests for FY24. The goal in general is to better project out-year projects so that they can be incorporated into our budget projections and start to develop plans around that. Personally, I'm very excited about this. I've been doing capital budgeting for more than 20 years. I started at the state level. I wrote my master's thesis on capital budgeting. So
Thriller.
It won an award, believe it or not.
I'm sure it did. That's terrific to know. I didn't know that. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Jennifer, I asked this question in front of our consultant group. their suggestion and their assertion that other towns budget capital first and then apply the rest of the revenue to the operating budget seems implausible. And to me, the process seems more dynamic than that. In the past, I think perhaps I was never on the capital budget committee, but they were given a sliver of an allocation, and how do you go spend it? It seems like there needs to be more of a dynamic process in terms of deciding how much to allocate to capital versus operating, but it can't be figure out your capital needs first and then the leftovers go to operating.
Well, my experience is that the capital needs far exceed the available funds. And I think that the experience likely here is just that the needs have perhaps not been documented to the extent that they could be. And I'm still exploring that, honestly, and I'm making broad assertions, so I apologize if I'm offending anyone. But my goal is going to be to start just planning. Let's just get the numbers down, and then let's see what they look like. Let's start to slot them into years, start to figure out what the implications are if we don't fund them, what takes a priority over others, and I'm sure there'll be robust conversations around that. But there are needs, there aren't just operating budget needs, there are capital budget needs, and we need to make sure that we are evaluating those in a real-time basis and not just simply not asking for things because we know they can't be funded.
And are we prepared to have some sort of reduction in operating expenses and services because there are necessary capital needs? Because often the dynamic is, well, sorry, I guess the capital is going to need to be postponed. And that's what we were told. You can't stay in that box, but at the same time, you can't, at least in my view, completely prioritize capital and have operating budget be a secondary.
If I could just, that is not my decision. That would be a decision for others. But if I could, one of the pieces that I think is important is this is why the focus is on reducing the amount of one-time revenue that's going to support the operating budget. If we can divert the one-time sources to capital needs, at least it might not be a consistently sustainable, but those are more. You have a little bit more flexibility on the capital, and that's also where putting it into a stabilization fund where it could be drawn down in a future year in a more of a planned expenditure, a planned investment, that would be more appropriate.
That's the idea. Is to seed and fund a capital stabilization fund, Jack, that can be used to additional funds that could be used prospectively for capital needs, one-time needs, beyond what we typically spend within our operating budget. Does that make sense?
That all sounds fine, but I would submit that what that's really saying is we're only going to fund capital to the extent that it does not impact our operating budget. And I think we're going to find ourselves in the same position that we are unless we as a community are prepared to, at some level, it may be small, I don't know, no value judgment there, but at some level prioritize a capital need over an operating need.
Well, I mean, so I'm not saying you can do both. Go ahead.
I think this is just a larger conversation. Given the time, it might be.
Thanks for the comments, yeah. Appreciate it. Don't disagree. Thank you for the comments. Okay, any other questions on this slide? Why don't we roll to the final slide we have for tonight?
This is just a very brief, we were having this group, in this meeting tonight, and so we just wanted to give you a preview of what is likely going to be on the warrant for fall town meeting. The select board will be voting the warrant on November 7th, so that will be a little bit more clarity at that point. But obviously, we have 2 debt exclusion projects on the ballot for November 8th. Those will be on the warrant pending the results of that. So they might be tabled if something
One or both of them aren't successful, right?
Thank you. Yes. So we've talked about establishing a capital stabilization fund. The leaf blower bylaw was postponed from the annual town meeting, so that will be taken up at fall town meeting. There's the recommendation from the Collins Center to transition from an elected to an appointed treasurer collector. There's a public forum on that topic next Thursday, so that will have further discussions around that. And then we are projecting a supplemental budget need for the Recreation Department. We've funded their budget at a pre-COVID level, and they have been going gangbusters with programming. And so the revenue is coming in to support that programming. We just need to update their budget to let them actually produce the programs. And then there is, Elizabeth could probably speak to this better than I can, but there is a request for a supplemental budget for the town hall roof, which is a project that was approved a couple of years ago, and the bids have come in a little bit higher than was originally requested.
Do you want a quick description of that right now, or I can wait till another time?
Real brief, please, Elizabeth, real brief.
So extremely briefly, a few years ago, the town approved $100,000 to repair the slate roofs of, I think, not just town hall, I think it's town hall complex. Because of the combination of COVID and the prior facilities director leaving, nothing happened. David Blazon, to his credit, revived the project. Town meeting had appropriated $100,000. The town got a single bid. I was on vacation in July when I got this panic call from David Blazon, single bid for $330,000. And so I requested that Dave submit, or I recommended that he submit an off-cycle funding request, which typically only is for emergencies for a number of reasons. We felt that this qualified, it met all our conditions. A special town meeting. So he's requesting a supplemental amount of $230,000. This really does need to happen now. First of all, if we actually have enough money, we hope to get a few more bids in, so that it's really a competitive bidding process and not just a single bidder. Second, if town meeting approves and appropriates this, then this can go out to bid late winter, early spring, and actually happen this coming summer. Whereas if we wait for the regular cycle, the money's not available till July 1. So that's the quick summary. My hope is that this will be non-controversial and very quick.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Reply.
Great. So we've talked about this earlier. Our next meeting is in December 14th. We'll have updates on revenue projections and the shared services budgets. We'll also have an initial revenue allocation for fiscal year 2024 and start to project our 3-year budget projections to include both revenue and spending preliminary. We'll be having conversations with the schools about what those numbers would look like. So it might just be more of a framework than an actual, kind of like real projections to be able to really start to hang our hat on. But at least it will just start us to have a conversation around that structure. Then at the January 12th meeting, again, we'll update those 3-year projections to incorporate the high-level school budget for FY24, and then and further refine that revenue allocation for FY24, and that will help us lead into the town's budget that will be produced on February 2nd.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was just outstanding presentation. We really appreciate it. Any final questions from the panelists? And we do have one attendee that has her hand up. Lori.
I just want to say that I think the 3-year projections for revenue are really important, because listening to everybody here, I feel like we're in the same spot where we know that the needs are greater than probably what we're able to afford, and we're not able to meet all the needs that we all see and understand. And so I think one of the things that I really liked about this process was focusing on revenue driving what we're able to afford, because my other concern, frankly, is an override is going to be needed pretty soon. And if it fails, we have to understand what that means. So we're not going along at a level service or even restoring some positions that we feel are very critical. And then all of a sudden we're going to have this cliff we're all talking about if the override fails because the recession hits or the tax bills are up or for whatever reason. I think we have to seriously consider what that looks like. I don't want it to happen, but I think we have to fully understand the ramifications 2 to 3 years out to make sure we have that horizon.
All right, can somebody admit Peg Calhoun?
So she's been allowed to talk.
Peg?
Mark, I appreciate tonight the abundance of information in this presentation. What I was a little bit concerned about, voters supported the debt exclusion for the Belmont Middle and High School. Given the two upcoming November 8 debt exclusions, I'm wondering if the superintendent can give us some kind of an estimate as to what additional expenses beyond the debt exclusion costs have been or will be or have already been incurred above and beyond what the taxpayers already supported. For example, in maintenance and increased staffing, I think it would be helpful for taxpayers to be informed of future additional expenses that are related to any kind of a positive debt exclusion vote. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Peg. A good point. PJ Looney, could someone?
Well, do we want to answer?
Well, do you want to respond to that, John?
That's
just a request.
Related to the rink or related to the?
Well, I think the point that Peg is making is that when we go out for debt exclusions, is it possible to also comment on if they're successful, what additional operating costs we might incur with new buildings?
That's it, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you, Peg.
Mark, if I might, if we were going to have that conversation, I would also like to know how much we're saving on not continuing to repair.
That's the challenge, right? So that's. I think Peg makes a point that I know she's
from a facilities point, or from an educational standpoint.
What's that?
From a facilities standpoint, or from a?
So I think what Peg was. No, I don't want to speak for you, Peg, but maybe you can articulate. I think it relates to the middle and high school building as well as the new debt exclusions and what additional operating costs are attendant to debt exclusions that we might consider putting on ballots in the future.
Yeah,
and
at this point, I'm just looking for, in terms of the Belmont Middle and High School, we have additional costs for maintenance, and certainly I'm hearing additional costs for staffing that was not part of any discussion prior to the override positive.
Debt exclusion. Yeah, and so Peg, I think what's important, and Jeff made this point, is that's going to be articulated by John. You heard him talk about the needs in the new middle school, the 7th to 8th cohort. But I think the other side of that as well, Peg, is it's important to understand where there's savings in building a new school. So I think we need to look at both.
Right, but is there any estimate as to what already has been incurred or will be incurred?
So generally speaking, to the Belmont Middle High School, as it relates to the educational funding, we have been each budget year projecting forward the potential costs related to staffing the 7 through 12 school and the 4 to 6 school. That dialogue and that mapping of the necessary staff was this long 8x14 document that we would provide every year that was color-coded by fiscal year, by when each of the phases would open. So that discussion has been happening, Peg, for several years leading up to COVID, where we then just kind of stopped it and recalibrated for two reasons. One is a lot of the projections of enrollment no longer matter because COVID disrupted that process. And we need to focus on the students that we have with us that are less than what we had before, and will be obviously showing more need for support in different ways. But the numbers of staff needed for the new school, we've been talking about for a while, but we will have that conversation specifically for next year in the coming weeks.
But is there an estimate that you can give now for the actual costs?
No, there is not.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peg. PJ Looney, can somebody admit PJ, please? PJ, you've been admitted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can,
Hello?
PJ. Please identify yourself.
PJ Looney, Town Meeting, Precinct 7. I got a couple questions, relatively quick questions. The first one's for John Phelan. Pretty straightforward. This middle school addition at the high school opens in the spring, hopefully, fingers crossed. the modulars at the multiple schools, are those being sold or are they not sellable? And if they are being sold, will that money go into the general budget, the school budget, or pay down the debt exclusion for the high school?
PJ, Patrice and I have spoken with Dave Blazon. Those modular spaces were bought with town money, so the decision as to what happens with them will be a town decision. That money will be returned. Whatever money is made, be it selling them or using them differently, will go back to the town fund, right? General fund.
General fund. Okay, thank you. Jennifer, by the way, great presentation for both of you. Couple questions, pretty straightforward. Page 4. You had I just want to make sure I understood it. I know everybody was kind of a little confused on it. At the end of fiscal year 24, assuming, I know this is preliminary, there'd be about $2 million in free cash plus the turnbacks from fiscal year 23. Is that accurate? Is that how I should read into that?
That's correct,
okay.
PJ.
All right. So we have no idea what that will be for 23, but
No.
Okay.
We do trend. We try to get quarterly. I mean, if you watch some of the select board meetings, I mean, we've implemented no less than quarterly report outs from the town administrator on our budget experience. And PJ, haven't done this for a long time. Actuals never matter, but somewhat close. And we just went through the 21 budget, right? The 21 budget, 22 budget, fairly close, but actuals never really completely mirror what budget is. So is the assumption that there will be overages on the revenue side and underages on expenditures? Likely. We don't know at this point, but we will know as we move into the third and fourth quarters of next year. Yes.
Technically based on this, just correct me if I'm wrong on this, just technically based on this slide projected, we're looking at about an $8 million structural deficit based on $6 million free cash operating budget.
That's correct.
$2 million from, I don't know what, COVID funds or whatever you want to call those.
That's the way to look at it.
Yep. Page 7, just so I understand, the the tax levy, 7, one more slide. Just kick up one more. Okay, so we're saying that the tax levy increased by 3.3%. So is that's the free cash difference between the 2.5% and 3%, 3.3%?
No, that's incorrect. So free cash does not, free cash appears within the available funds line. What happens, I'm actually glad you raised this point. I forgot to mention this last time I showed this slide. I had it all just as a combined property tax levy line, but this actually breaks the two out. So the property tax levy is allowed to grow by 2.5% from one year to the next. And so that's assumed in this. We also are allowed to have a new growth factor that the assessors are hard at work determining right now, and that is currently projected at $860,000 for FY24. So then you add those two together, and that's where the 3.3% increase comes in. The secondly, where the tax levy also includes the amounts to be raised for exempt debt, and at this point, I'm still confirming these numbers with the treasurer, but the number for FY24 is $540,000 less at this point than the amounts for FY23, and that's a 3.9% decrease. And so then the overall increase becomes a 2.5%.
That's without these things that are on the ballot, though, right? Yeah.
Everything's without.
Go ahead, PJ.
That makes sense. There's two last things. The exempt debt, you just answered the question, but there's legislation that's trying to get through that would tax nonprofits at their usage rates, not on schools, but others. Do we have any idea how much, assuming 20 million is the baseline, do we have any idea? Has that been looked into or discussed by the Warrant Committee? If we're able to charge nonprofits?
I'm not aware of that legislation. Is it at the state level, PJ?
Legislative. Somerville and Cambridge are pushing it. It hasn't been approved.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, PJ, you might have heard us say this. I mean, tax exempt 501c3 organizations, you cannot tax them. And so the Warrant Committee can put together a working group that I'm going to participate in. And I think we're also going to have the support of the chair of the Board of Assessors. We've not done a good job on this. We've attempted it. I'm not saying we haven't done a good job. We haven't had much success on payment in lieu of taxes. and that is approaching our tax exempt entities in town, many of which you might know, in terms of providing some support to us in lieu of our ability to assess, because we can't statutorily, based on the level of services based on the services that we provide to them. Cambridge has had enormous success on this, so hasn't Watertown and other communities. So we're not giving up on that revenue source. But I'm not aware of any legislative provisions in Cambridge or Somerville. Do you have that information? If you could send it to me, that'd be helpful.
I can forward that on.
I'm not aware of it, but, you know, it's a challenge. They can just simply say no, and and Adam has been a part of this, in which we reach out to schools in town that are 501c3s other than our school system, and the religious establishments and others, to ask for some contribution on pilot. We haven't had enormous success on that, but we are recommitting ourselves to doing that.
And then the last one is not a question on the budget, but it's just a general question. Not even question, it's just a general opinion. I had spent time today down at the farmer's market, talked to probably 8 or 9 people on different subjects. And I'll tell you, most of them, actually all of them, none of them heard of the Collins report. I think part of that is we don't really have a conduit anymore that reports on the local news from the newspaper standpoint. But one of the things I'm trying to wrap my arms around is in 2021, wasn't that long ago, 18 months or so, we had a pretty hard debate over the override. And the position of those at the time on the board and on the Warrant Committee, or at least the collective, maybe not all individual, was that we had a structural deficit and the use of one-time funds would, it just wouldn't work. You could do it and it's just going to grow the deficit. So obviously the override didn't pass. We used the one-time funds. COVID created a unique situation where, state budgets became flush with federal money and so on, and everything kind of worked in our favor. But it kind of feels to me like the Warrant Committee and school select board are now they've changed their tune. We're going to keep using these funds, and the structural deficit is not as urgent as it was back just 18 months ago. I mean, it was pretty vociferous debate about why we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do this. Now it feels like, yeah, we're just going to keep doing it. So that's something to think about. And that's it. I appreciate your time.
Well, I don't think we're going to keep on doing that. I mean, I think we've committed ourselves, and if you've read the Collins report, I think you have, and just posted on our website. And I do intend to make a presentation at town meeting, DJ, on that as well. I've asked the moderator if I could present, at least at a high level, the 19 recommendations that were provided to us, which is similar to what was provided to us back in 2011 in the Division of Local Services report. We are attempting not to do that going forward. We have been fortunate through the ARPA funds and the fact that a number of positions weren't filled to have the turnbacks that we had. We have abundant free cash, but as Steve Cirillo, if you listen to that presentation, there may become a time in which the one-time funds will exhaust themselves, and then we're left with having to fund a structural deficit. You're right. You read that correctly in terms of it's $8 million projected for next year because we're using one-time funds. So the sense of urgency remains. And the balance, PJ, that we try to, you heard me earlier, the tension that we have is we don't want to raise taxes if we can avoid that. And so we've continued to rely on one-time funds. And we did stretch that 2015 override longer than we had anticipated and expected. And so to the extent that we can continue to do that without just relying on and setting ourselves up for a huge fiscal cliff in future years, we will do that. But at some point in time, we do need to reduce our reliance on one-time funds because that's what they are. They're not recurring receipts, and get back to sort of budgeting in a normal way, which I've been doing this for quite some time. I've never seen that. And Jeff, you want to comment on that as well?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think, the override failed, and there were some additional funds that have come into the picture that were not part of the picture when we were pushing
7.8 million ARPA, right?
Exactly, and it was very uncertain what was going to be available. So we have benefited from that, but I think if you look, the replenishment rates are starting to slow, and eventually these one-time windfalls are going to go away, and we will wind up needing an override. And I think what we want to do here is manage that over the next couple of years so that we get to the point where we are just, we know we'll need an override, but we're also able to manage the size of that override. And that's how we're going to look at the budgeting for this year, this coming year and the next, and whatever years out before we finally have to go in front of the voters. But I think it's a strategic decision that we're all committed to.
Thank you.
If I
Was
could,
that Jeff? I didn't hear it. Who was that?
Yeah, that was Jeff.
Jeff Luby, and Chair of the Warrant Committee.
Jeff, yeah, I know Jeff. Hey, Jeff. Thanks, Jeff. I would point out the Financial Task Force too did recommend more frequent and smaller, and it just.
Yeah, well, if you look at it if you look at it from that point of view, right, and that's been our recommendation that's been out there since Will Brownsberger served on the board. I mean, is it easier for the community, PJ, and they're out there quite a bit, to accept every 3 or 4 or 5 years a smaller override rather than a large one like we had in the 21 year? Perhaps that is to be considered. I mean, there's only 2 levers to pull. Either we can get more revenues or we can reduce our expenses. We're not going to get more revenues based on Prop 2.5. We've tried to live within that framework. We've had one successful override over the past 40 years, from 2015, if I recall, maybe 2. Was there an earlier one?
Yeah.
But 4.5 was the largest override we've ever had. And before that, it was quite a few. We have managed to live within that framework. We can't rely on state aid to bail us out, although we've been fortunate to have incremental increases there. So the other lever to pull is expenditures. The challenge there is these are services that the community expects us to deliver, and it's really difficult to reduce them. And how do you prioritize what to reduce? We will all have different opinions in that. And so the only other thing you look at is, can you deliver them in a different way? I've been saying that for quite some time. Structure Change Impact Group looked at that. So I think there's ways that we can deliver the same services differently and more efficiently and less costly. It's going to take some time to get there, but I think we have to do that because at some point the residents, they have said no once, they might say no again. And planning for the future with smaller sort of increases in tax might be a way for us, all of us collectively, to balance our home budgets as well. But you're not looking at a board that likes to raise taxes, willy-nilly. There's just a need, unless we decide to reduce expenses, which can be really challenging to do.
I appreciate that. The only point I'm making to you, and that's why I made the statement, is if you bring up more frequent and smaller and they get rejected, the taxpayer knows and has an expectation that, hey, we got a problem going on. It's when you sneak up after a few years, a big vote goes, you spend all this money on a high school and you punch them in the gut with the big one, that you build a lot of animosity in the town where people feel like they're not being, fed a true bill of goods. So the little ones, even if they fail, at least sends the message that, we need money and we're not trying to hit you all at once. And if we keep rejecting it, a logical person will say, well, we kept rejecting this and this, so it's growing. I just don't think the town people know. They don't know about the Collins report. I don't think they know about the structural deficit. They might have.
Well, it's available in there. You heard me earlier say, and I appreciate you joining tonight, that many times folks don't pay attention to the last minute. And do we have to do a better job of communicating? I think we do. We're trying collectively as a body here tonight through these budget summits and other. But a lot of folks in town, PJ, are busy and they don't pay attention as much as they should. I'm not certain if you have thoughts about ways that we can communicate more effectively, then that's fine. But we have budget summits. The Warrant Committee has dozens of meetings during the year. The Select Board, we have all of the subcommittee meetings that the Warrant Committee has, our posted meetings. Folks want to tune in more. I mean, we'd appreciate that and get questions like that from yourself. So that's helpful. Thanks for joining tonight.
Thanks for your time.
Right.
I just wanted to close and just kind of point out that we've actually updated could you slide back up? The towns has updated our budget tab so that we now are linking to all of the budget summit materials are posted. And we've also posted the Collins Center report. So I just wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to be able to find the materials.
All right, well, thank you all.
And it's there. So,
Thanks for the folks that did attend, and maybe there's some folks at home watching on TV.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's great.
So with that, we're a little bit past. We're 9:40. So thank you all for hanging in there for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Great presentation, Jennifer. Thank you, Patrice. Thank you, John.
I'd like to say, yeah, thank you to Jennifer and Matt for all the work they've done, not only on budget and presentation, but on this and
appreciate
some of this. I think this is fantastic, and the fact that we're talking about these things now.
I think it's great to have these budget summits. We haven't really had them in this way. And I remember I don't know, on the Warrant Committee when we used to have the Saturday morning meetings, and those are lengthy. And this is similar to that. And so we're going to have meetings with town departments the week of the 5th, and hopefully folks that tune in tonight will tune in for those. And I know it's difficult because people work and have other things that they have in their lives other than this. So we're going to do as much as we can to ensure that the community is better informed, if you will, or more informed than we've historically provided. So with that, I guess I'll turn to school committee did not convene, but the Warrant Committee did. So I'll move to the Warrant Committee.
Bob?
Move to adjourn.
You have a second? I'll go just roll call on the people online. Elizabeth?
Yes.
Bob?
Yep.
Matt?
Yes.
Paul?
Yes.
Chris?
Yes.
And all of us here? Aye.
Aye. On behalf of the Select Board, I want to thank the Warrant Committee, members of the School Committee, School Department, Long-Term Capital Planning Committee, for your ongoing work with us and your approach and to the budget season this year and efforts that we're putting forward. So we really appreciate that. So move to adjourn. Second. All in favor? Aye. Aye.